From a very young age, every man, woman, and child inhabiting the Imperium of the 40th millennium is educated in the hatred and contempt for the Xenos, mutants, and heretics. On each of the hundreds of thousands of worlds which make up the domains of the Emperor God, not a day passes without the agents of the Adeptus Administratum or the Ecclesiarchy relentlessly preaching their propaganda, urging every citizen, whether noble of the great houses or impoverished denizens of hive cities, to see in the human being a superior race, destined to reign over the galaxy. Conversely, whether out of necessity to face the multiple threats looming over it, or out of conviction, the Imperium, through its institutions, educates its people to view the countless Xenos species populating the Milky Way as inferior and bellicose beings. Any contact with them is strictly prohibited. Any interest in their culture, attraction to their history, or attempt to learn even a little more about them is forbidden and severely punished. Regarding these enemies of humanity, only one thing is taught: to feel no compassion, no pity, but to harbor pure and burning hatred towards them. Among the many races hostile to the Imperium, none receive such disdain and disgust at the mere mention of its name as the Orcs. Described as primitive, violent, stupid, and ugly, the greenskins are often mocked and seen as animals by the denizens of the Empire. Wild beasts, proving by their mere appearance and intellect how inferior they are. For millennia, commemorators and imperial propaganda have unceasingly recounted the numerous victories against these repugnant creatures, repeatedly narrating the legendary battles fought by the heroes of the Imperium against the hordes of greenskins, ineluctably demonstrating that, despite numerical inferiority against a formidable enemy, the bravery, fortitude, and intelligence unique to humans could triumph over these loathsome beasts. However, these stories consistently omitted to mention that for each of these victories, the Imperium had suffered just as many, if not more, humiliating defeats at the hands of its oldest enemy. Nevertheless, this deliberately constructed image to prove the greatness of the human race continued to spread over time, gradually embedding itself in the collective unconscious over the millennia that followed. As centuries passed, orcs became a subject of mockery, the epitome of weakness, ugliness, stupidity, everything humanity opposed. During banquets in the ruling spheres, the nobles laughed with disdain and scorn, imagining the grotesque existences led by these primitive creatures. The common citizens, on the other hand, didn't even bother, as, according to what they had been taught, orcs had been defeated, broken so many times by the Emperor's armies that they didn't pose a real threat. Yet, when the sky darkened and the countless trails of fire from their ships tore through the firmament, those witnessing the spectacle remained transfixed, frozen with fear at what was about to unfold. Because when the war arrived, when the fury of the orcs unleashed upon one of those worlds, all the beliefs instilled in those populations quickly went up in smoke. In an ineffable cacophony, where wild screams and sadistic laughter strangely mingled, the veil of lies tore apart, taking with it the last illusions of a race that had believed itself so superior to those it had reduced to primitives. In reality, those who had to fight against the greenskins knew it all too well. They knew and understood why the Imperium kept it hidden from its citizens, simply because it was too terrifying and inconvenient to be known. If it leaked out, panic would spread throughout the Empire. No stable society could prosper by realizing that for over 10,000 years it owed its survival solely to the goodwill of its enemies. realizing that, if they wished, these enemies could, in an instant, annihilate everything the Imperium had taken so long to build. The sacrifice of heroic warriors had indeed somewhat contributed to keeping the threat at bay, but the salvation of humanity, like the other species populating the Milky Way, fundamentally rested on the nature of the greenskins. Their entire existence is geared toward one and only one goal: to fight. To fight constantly, all the time, tirelessly. To fight again and again against all the species populating the Milky Way. To fight not out of hatred or any desire to see their species prosper, no. Orcs care about none of that, and that's what makes them frightening. Frightening because they cannot be reasoned with, impressed, or pushed to surrender for one simple reason. Orcs fight for their amusement, for the excitement that war brings them, because they are war. They embody violence, the purest and most brutal violence, and when they no longer find enemies to fight, their clans tear each other apart in battles lasting for centuries. It seems absurd that a species geared towards war, a species that spends its time killing each other, could have developed among the stars. And yet, as with many things related to the greenskins, everything about them is absolutely illogical. Despite all this, orcs are like cancer spreading throughout the galaxy, a contamination present everywhere in it. Their gigantic hordes constantly die and are reborn. They thrive in violence, prosper in blood, and implode when they no longer have common enemies to unite them. And that is the terrible reality that all the peoples of the galaxy must face. If the orcs ceased their fratricidal struggles, if they stopped their barbaric games and decided to unite, then absolutely no force could stop them. This terrible fact the Imperium knows only too well, and has known for a long time. Indeed, on rare occasions, driven by a vision, an orc warlord manages to rise above the others and unite the clans present in thousands of solar systems around. If this happens, then he is capable of unleashing a massive war, a sacred crusade where the greenskins unite for a time to ravage the galaxy. Thus, during the 32nd millennium, a warlord called the Beast raised the greatest war ever seen, even larger than the one defeated by Horus Lupercal on Ulanor during the Great Crusade. This cataclysm, the extent of the damage of which is still concealed from the public today, caused as many losses as the heresy, making it the deadliest conflict in the history of the Imperium. The crusade marked even more minds because, beyond the losses incurred, the orcs infiltrated so deeply into the solar segmentum that they nearly reached Terra and shattered what remained of an empire in full reconstruction. This event, called the War of the Beast, was a real shock, an unprecedented cataclysm for the ruling authorities, proving indeed to the Imperium that its golden age was now over. The terrible conflicts it had faced had bled it dry, and now its enemies were massing at its borders to deliver the final blow. However, the Imperium was not ready to give up, and intended once again to successfully face the challenge before it. To stem the panic spreading among the populations, the high dignitaries of the Empire promptly charged the Inquisition to create a new order, to study and find means to face the greenskins and other extraterrestrial species populating the galaxy. Thus, from these events was born an organization that would become increasingly powerful within the Imperium. The Ordo Xenos was born, and with it, its own militant chamber, the all-powerful Death Watch. Following the Beast's War, The Ordo Xenos quickly realized that sheer force would be insufficient to defeat such an enemy if a similar event were to occur again. To confront it, a meticulous study was necessary, learning everything about it to identify its weaknesses. 2 crucial measures were then taken. The first involved founding the Death Watch, a unique Astartes chapter. It would consist of almost no permanent members, recruiting the most seasoned warriors from various Space Marine chapters experienced in combating Xenos. These specialists would gather in extermination teams, providing their expertise and undertaking missions of indefinite duration for the Ordo Xenos. Joining the Death Watch meant participating in the most dangerous and secretive operations. Those chosen were considered legends within the Adeptus Astartes, bringing pride and honor to their original chapters. To carry out their mission successfully, these elite fighters focused their training on handling the most serious Xenos threats, equipped with the best technology and equipment of the time. However, knowing that having its own army wouldn't be sufficient to face the impending threats, the Ordo Xenos implemented a second measure. Collaborating with the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Inquisition assigned their tech priests to study alien technologies and weapons. Numerous missions involving researchers and Magos biologists were dispatched to study their enemies in detail. Every aspect, from their anatomy, morphology, societies to their beliefs, was meticulously studied, leaving no detail to chance. Due to the events of the Beasts' War, the priority was given to the study of orcs. The results of these years of analysis led to a deep sense of bewilderment and incomprehension, facing the absurdity and impossibilities observed. From an anatomical standpoint, greenskins are much larger than humans, although their hunched posture may suggest otherwise. Their muscular bodies are incredibly robust, displaying an incredible resistance to pain. Even with critical injuries, many greenskins can continue fighting. Lost limbs can be stitched and operational within minutes, and remarkably, the decapitated head of an orc can be transplanted onto another body if done within a short time. The reasons behind this remarkable regenerative ability remain a mystery. The Magos biologists hypothesized that it might be due to a combination of organic and fungal properties within greenskins, coupled with the presence of unknown origin algae with regenerative properties at the cellular level. Among other peculiarities observed, it seems that as orcs age and accumulate confidence through battles, their bodies undergo transformations, growing larger, bulkier, and more powerful. One of their most fascinating characteristics, however, is their reproductive ability. Throughout their lives, orcs release spores carried by the wind. Upon death, the process accelerates, releasing numerous spores. If these land in a warm and humid environment, they accumulate, giving rise to new orcs and other orcoid subspecies such as squigs and snotlings. This seemingly implausible capability makes eradicating an infestation nearly impossible. Once a world is infested, their spread becomes endemic and uncontrollable. Researchers, despite observing their functioning, couldn't comprehend how nature allowed the development of such creatures. However, the absurdity of their existence doesn't stop there. Intellectually, most orcs possess limited abilities. They are incapable, for instance, of conceiving complex tools and technologies. What they use is often the result of looting. Their language is a mix of grunts, pig-like cries, and a simplistic vocabulary derived from Low Gothic, which they likely copied due to their empires being frequently located within human territories. Although their limited intelligence may lead to underestimation, it's a grave mistake. Like their strength, their cunning grows over time, and though rare, some orc warlords, after centuries of existence, can devise complex strategies and plans that many greenskins below them execute without fully understanding. For many researchers, the limited intellectual capacities of greenskins should have constrained their development. However, reality proved otherwise. Despite their rudimentary societies, orcs are by far the most prolific race in the Milky Way, with their vast empires extending across it. Despite their simplicity being noted as a weakness to exploit, paradoxically, it is their greatest strength. A strength because orcs never question how their society works. They accept their conditions and live an existence devoid of anxiety, solely focused on the excitement derived from battles and the pleasure of seeing the weak suffer and perish. Indeed, greenskins adhere to a single rule: the primacy of the strongest. They feel no compassion, no pity for the weak, and even revel in their torment. Observing fear and sorrow in the eyes of their enemies fills them with joy. Witnessing the tears of a child whose parents they massacred brings laughter, not from sadistic deviation, but from the perceived absurdity of emotions they don't comprehend. Absolutely everything about orcs revolves around this principle of violence and domination. Their societies rise on the millions of corpses of their weaker kin. Each day, an infinite number of orcs are born and die, a perpetual cycle of excessive and absurd violence, giving rise to the most powerful and ruthless creatures. Initially leading their closest groups through sheer strength, these terrifying beings are called bosses. The more victories they achieve, the more their confidence grows and their bodies transform, growing larger and more powerful. This signals to all nearby orcs that they have no choice but to obey and serve if they wish to live. Once they have an army under their command, the cycle of violence resumes, as the various bands led by bosses engage in merciless wars to seize leadership of their clans and rise higher in the hierarchy. However, a question quickly arose during these observations. How could beings whose existence is exclusively guided by the will to fight and make war evolve to conceive unimaginable war machines and fleets enabling them to navigate between stars? To this question, the Magos quickly found an answer through an explanation once again challenging their scientific logic. Within Orc society exists a special caste of greenskins called Odd Boys. Comprising different subclasses, these beings live on the fringes of internal struggles and are respected by other greenskins. For example, mech boys repair and design war machines with improbable characteristics, while pain boys heal the wounded when not too busy conducting experiments as terrifying as they are absurd. The most enigmatic beings within this caste, however, are the terrifying Weird Boys, shamans revered and feared by other orcs, capable of drawing energy from the warp to unleash torrents of spells on their enemies. But what is most astonishing about these creatures is that they haven't learned their knowledge. They were born with it, as if this knowledge had been directly transmitted through their genes. This inconceivable ability, coupled with all the astonishing discoveries made about orcs, made the Ordo Xenos researchers realize that what they were studying could not have originated from natural evolution. It seemed that all the abilities present in orcs had developed to make them formidable weapons, as if this entire species had been designed for a single purpose: war. However, these theories quickly raised new questions. What conflict could have necessitated the creation of orcs? Who could have generated a species with such prodigious characteristics? And, most importantly, what enemy could require the development of such a weapon? These questions persisted and remained unanswered, but the ultimate phase of the study on orcs nevertheless verified their theory. While all the discoveries made about them are as absurd and implausible as each other, none surpasses the understanding like what the researchers observed in this final discovery. Orcs can modify, or rather alter, reality. Although it seems utterly impossible, it turns out that if enough of them gather and strongly believe in something, reality will warp to make their belief real. The only possible hypothesis to conceive of this madness is that, although unaware of their own capabilities, greenskins seem to possess a latent psychic link uniting the species, allowing them to manipulate reality through the warp. For example, if enough orcs believe that painting their armor a certain color will make them more powerful or faster, then they will become so. If they believe that their war machines, composed of an improbable mix of sheets, scraps, and other stone materials, can move, then they will. And if the orcs want to travel from one point in the galaxy to another to unleash their fury, if the war energy around them is strong enough, then space itself will tear apart to allow their ships to pass. Faced with all these discoveries, many were stupefied, unable to conceive how it would be possible to combat a species possessing so many supernatural and terrifying abilities. The Inquisitors in charge of the Ordo Xenos, however, were not the type to resign. Regardless of the results obtained and the implications involved, they had a mission to fulfill. In conjunction with the Death Watch, they implemented a series of measures to halt the greenskins' advance. Pragmatically, they accepted the fact that the Imperium would never have the forces necessary to eradicate Orc empires within its domains. Instead, they focused their efforts on limiting the damage caused and, above all, preventing the formation of wars as massive as the one that ravaged the Segmentum Solar during the Beasts' War. To achieve this, they decided to concentrate their actions on the rare weaknesses of orcs, namely their predictability and hierarchical structure. Thus, over the millennia that followed, numerous wars formed, ravaging tens of thousands of worlds within the Imperium. However, each time, the Ordo Xenos managed to accomplish what it was created for. Their strategy was relentless and highly effective. Leveraging the assassins of the Ordo Assassinorium and the extermination teams of the Death Watch, they worked to eliminate the most powerful Orc warlords. With this objective achieved, their armies, seeking new leaders, engaged in internecine struggles, leaving Imperial forces to contend with significantly weakened adversaries. The Ordo Xenos also developed other ways to combat the greenskins, such as creating biological weapons or engaging their forces to redirect them toward more favorable and better defended theaters of operations or directly towards the domains of the enemies of the Imperium. However, despite averting the worst many times over these millennia of struggles, the inevitable happened with the birth of an orc with extraordinary abilities. A warlord who, through great cunning and terrifying strength, managed to survive all assassination attempts to stop him. The Imperium did not yet know, but this being, named Ghazghkull mac Uruk Thraka, would become the greatest warlord in the history of the Orcs. No one knows where Ghazghkull Thraka was born, but legends about him recount that when he was a low-ranking, weak orc, he participated in a raid on a Space Marine chapter world where he was hit by a bolt in the head. The shot tore through his skull and took a significant portion of his brain away with it. However, after several hours of surgery, the medicos of his clan managed to save him and implanted an adamantium prosthesis on what remained of his face. After this event, Ghazghkull began to have visions and claimed to anyone who would listen that Gork and Mork, the two gods of the greenskins, spoke to him in his dreams. Although considered mad, no one could determine whether these visions were indeed real or if they were due to delirium caused by his injury. One thing is certain, Ghazghkull became a messenger, telling the greenskins he encountered that the gods were displeased with them, that the orc race was stagnating, being deceived for far too long by these pathetic humans, and it was time to make them pay for this affront. Initially scorned and mocked by his peers, he nevertheless managed over the following years to gradually gather the most influential greenskins to his side. Now leading his own army, Ghazghkull continued his meteoric rise within his clan, massacring the forces of his opponents in ruthless power struggles where his strength and great cunning began to increase his fame. Afterwards, it is said that he continued to climb the ranks until he became a respected warlord by all greenskins in the surrounding worlds. His rapidly growing prestige, following countless victories, soon reached the ears of the Ordo Xenos within the various orc tribes located in the northern galaxy. Rumors spread to dozens of solar systems around, indicating that a being of terrifying power was uniting the clans to prepare them for a war that would soon engulf the galaxy. A being feared by all and bearing the title of the Prophet. Initially seen as just another warlord, the Inquisitors of the Ordo quickly realized that this creature was perhaps the most cunning they had encountered among the greenskins. Indeed, the assassination attempts all ended in bitter failure. Failures that only increased Ghazghkull's reputation to the point that more and more orcs began to truly believe that he was truly the chosen one sent by their gods. Now at the head of a colossal force, the Prophet decided that it was time to fulfill the will of Gork and Mork. It was time for a demonstration, to send a message to the humans. The orcs were back, and they were going to remind them of what real violence was. Excited by his words, hundreds of millions of orcs from the 5 major tribes under his command launched their fleets through the warp to go where their prophet would guide them. Now lost in the great ocean, the Ordo Xenos lost all trace of Ghazghkull and his armada. But after months of travel, where his warriors had to face hordes of demons, the prophet managed to bring his fleet where he wished, on the border of the Segmentum Solar, ready to strike at the heart of his enemy's domains. But before going any further, the orcs would have to crush the world in their path. A world known as one of the most fortified strongholds of the Empire, a world named Armageddon. Located in the sector of the same name, Armageddon is a world classified as a top priority resource by the Imperium for several reasons. Situated just 10,000 light-years northeast of Terra on the edge of the Segmentum Solar, it is a key point serving as a fortress world for threats from the Ultima Segmentum to the east and Segmentum Obscurus to the north. Beyond its highly strategic location, the planet is known for the numerous hive cities it houses and for possessing immense mining and fuel resources. Coupled with its overdeveloped industry, these make Armageddon a world of crucial importance, allowing other planets to survive thanks to exported equipment and materials. Despite thousands of years of intensive industrial exploitation reducing the majority of its surface to sterile wastelands, the planet still has numerous mining resources in the heart of its mountain ranges to the north, and especially significant oil reserves deep beneath its oceans. Geographically, Armageddon is made of 3 huge continents. The first of its North Pole precisely includes the planet's mining operations, named the Lands of Fire. While one might expect an Arctic climate in this area due to its location, intensive drilling and industry have transformed the continent's lands into arid and polluted wastelands, where miners live and work in suffocating heat. At the extreme opposite, all the way south of Armageddon, are the Deadlands, a frozen continent devoid of any form of life, except for the few workers in the processing factories tasked with turning ice into drinking water. And finally, between the storm ocean and the boiling seas lies Armageddon's main continent. A gigantic landstrip, crossed in its center by an immense equatorial jungle, the only place on the planet where vegetation persists. To the west of it is located the region of Armageddon Primus, and to the east, Armageddon Secundus. As a result of past intensive industrial exploitation in these areas, they are now composed of immense arid plains and radioactive ochre sand deserts stretching as far as the eye can see. Now devoid of any vegetation and resources, these desolate lands are where colossal structures of concrete and adamantium rise towards the sky, almost reaching the planet's orbit. These colossal hive cities of Armageddon are well known, and the most famous among them are Tempestora and Vulcanus to the west, and Infernus, Hades, Tartarus, Acheron, and Helsreach to the east. Adding to the fame of this world, these places with horrific living conditions are cities of cyclopean proportions that rise more than 10 kilometers high above the surface, and their depths are immeasurable. Their surface area varies, but can reach tens of thousands of square kilometers. These are utterly disproportionate, inconceivable figures, where in each of these cities, billions of human beings live crowded together. The vast majority of them remain confined to the lower areas of the hive, where they will likely never leave and where they will live a miserable existence. An existence to work to death in the city's manufactorums for more than 10 hours a day before returning to their squalid and dirty quarters in the lowest strata of the city. Authorities hardly intervene in these lower zones anymore, having long since abandoned the most miserable to the ruthless rule of gangs, who, as long as production quotas are met, are not troubled. The higher spheres, on the other hand, are occupied by the most affluent inhabitants, by noble houses, as well as by the temples of the ecclesiarchy and the buildings where imperial dignitaries live and work. The appalling living conditions of the population do not concern the ruling authorities at all, for indeed, as horrible and devoid of humanity as it may be, the vast majority of humans populating the hive cities are just another resource for the Imperium. An almost infinite resource, but necessary for the proper functioning of this world's industry and to fill the countless losses suffered by the armies of the Emperor God. And it is finally in war that the inhabitants of Armageddon find their one and only source of pride. Because this world is the one of the mighty Steel Legion, one of the most renowned regiments of the Imperial Guard. Among the hundreds of thousands of planets composing the Empire, many provide entire regiments to the Astra Militarum from their worlds. Although not possessing the quasi-divine prestige of the legendary warriors of the Adeptus Astartes, these simple humans make up the overwhelming majority of the Empire's armies. They are the ones who, every day, die by the millions on the countless theaters of operations scattered across the galaxy. They are the ones who repel the incessant assaults of the Emperor's enemies, and they are still the ones who defend his domains. Among the tens of thousands of regiments composing the Astra Militarum, some, like the Death Corps of Krieg, the Cadian Shock Troops, the Valhallan Ice Warriors, or the Steel Legion of Armageddon, have gained a particular reputation and prestige within the Imperium. For the inhabitants of Armageddon, the Legion is both a source of immense pride and hope. Hope for the billions of children populating the depths of the hive cities to escape their miserable condition. Hope to be able to do something with their lives, to be able to fight and die for the Emperor God. However, joining the Legion is not given to everyone, and only the most robust and courageous humans can pass the admission tests. Those who succeed will have the honor of receiving the ochre-colored uniform of the Steel Legion, a prestigious uniform, known and respected by all regiments of the Guard. But although renowned for the bravery of its soldiers, the Legion is also known for its numerous armoured regiments and its exceptionally high-quality equipment. Indeed, despite being charged with providing resources to hundreds of worlds throughout the Imperium, Armageddon's industry's primary concern is equipping its army with the best material it can produce. Due to all these combined elements, Armageddon has gained the reputation of being an unbeatable world, a stronghold within the Empire. A world against which it would be utterly senseless to launch an assault because no force could consider attacking a planet belonging to one of the most prestigious regiments of the Imperial Army. A planet capable of raising and equipping an army of several million soldiers among the most respected in the Imperium. Yet this reputation of invincibility almost faltered, and few know that Armageddon has already come close to falling once in the past. About this mysterious conflict that took place around the year 499 of the 41st millennium, almost nothing is known, and all information related to this subject has been censored by the Inquisition and the Ordo Malleus. Nevertheless, despite the desire to hide what happened, some rumors managed to spread. Rumors indicating that demons had come to Armageddon and ravaged this world. It would then have been the Sons of Rus, helped by a mysterious order of knights in silver armor, who pushed back this terrible threat at the cost of unimaginable military and civilian losses. Some of these stories even dare to affirm that if the information related to this event had been deleted, it's because they contain a terrible secret and proof that the Imperium committed one of the most ignoble acts towards those who saw what had happened on this world. Whatever the case may be, after more than 5 centuries, the war would now return to Armageddon. Unable to contain their excitement at the approach of the terrible carnage that awaited them, the greenskins forming Ghazkul's armada threw themselves into the assault on the minor planets as soon as they arrived in the system, ruthlessly massacring their populations before turning their attention to Armageddon. Lacking sufficient experience to manage such a massive army, the Prophet initially struggled to maintain cohesion among the 5 great tribes, causing numerous unnecessary losses among his troops. Nevertheless, in response to the Orcs' initial mistakes, the leaders of Armageddon made even worse strategic mistakes. Indeed, the nobles leading the world, indoctrinated by Imperial propaganda to see the greenskins as stupid and cowardly creatures, greatly underestimated their enemies and made decisions that would cost many human lives. Planetary Lord Hermann von Straub, assisted by the high dignitaries of the great houses, refused to pay attention to warnings from the High Command of the Steel Legion, especially to the incessant reminders from Commissar Sebastian Yarrick urging him to send a distress call to Terra. Months had passed since the Orcs arrived in the system, and although they had already ravaged the planets around Armageddon, the Imperial Governor deemed it unnecessary to request reinforcements, secretly hoping to crush the greenskins on his world with the help of the Legion and achieve a prestigious victory. But this arrogant and foolish plan quickly turned into a disaster when images from the first moments of the Armageddon invasion shocked von Straub and his staff. Images showing the uninterrupted flow of Orc ships descending from orbit for several days now. They also revealed that the greenskins did not intend to break Armageddon's resistance through sheer numbers. According to the given orders, it was undeniable that Ghazkul demonstrated true strategic and tactical abilities. In addition to simultaneous and coordinated assaults on all hive cities of Armageddon Primus, he also ensured the establishment of support bases in the heart of the Firelands, revealing a more subtle invasion plan than we would expect from such creatures. The Planetary Lord panicked, and horrified by the turn of events, still refused to seek any help. It was finally Commissar Yarrick, a high officer of the Astra Militarum known for his expertise in dealing with greenskins, who took the responsibility of bypassing von Strab's authorization to request aid from Terra. This insubordination against the highest Imperial dignitary present could have cost him his rank or even his life. But von Strab, although furious, knew he could not do without one of his most competent officers. Despite his outrage, Yarrick was forced to leave Planetary Command, taking charge of the defense of the hive city of Hades. The forces on Armageddon could not determine if their call for help had been heard by Terra, because a few days after this desperate attempt, warp storms erupted all around the system, making communication with the outside impossible and preventing any ships from entering or leaving the system. No one could determine if this cataclysm, which greatly diminished Armageddon's chances, was triggered by Ghazkul's bizarre boys or by the influx of psychic emanations released by the Orc's thirst for massacre. But whatever the answer, the inclusion was implacable. The world was now completely left to itself. The following months saw Armageddon descend into chaos. Not knowing how to react, the High Command, completely panicked, continued to make mistakes, engaging the Steel Legion in battles that were lost from the start, where it was crushed by the Prophet's armies. In this critical situation, von Strab ordered the abandonment of Armageddon Primus to its fate and decided to relocate his command center to the hive city of Tartarus in the far west of Armageddon Secundus to prepare a counteroffensive. After more than 6 months of defeats, the Planetary Lord had managed to gather a powerful army composed of several regiments of the Steel Legion and, most importantly, the entire Titan Legio Metallica. But as he was urged to keep his forces in defense within the walls of Tartarus, von Strab and his advisors once again ignored warnings and decided that it was time to crush the Orcs in a decisive battle before reclaiming Armageddon Primus. Unfortunately, this desperate counterattack resulted in one of the most humiliating defeats in the history of the Imperium. A debacle where the Planetary Lord's armies were crushed in a battle where Ghazkul demonstrated the extent of his tactical skills, using the supposedly impassable jungles to surprise his enemies by sending reinforcements from the west to encircle and destroy the Imperial forces. Following this defeat, terrified and convinced that all was now lost, von Strab abandoned Planetary Command and sought refuge in his personal bunker, unable to bear the responsibility for his actions. Deprived of any chain of command when they needed it most, long columns of troops retreated in disorder to arbitrarily chosen destinations. The fronts collapsed one after another, except for the one in the hive city of Hades, where Yarrick had been holding the Orc armies at bay for months. Despite the meager forces at his disposal, consisting of a few regiments of the Steel Legion, he had turned Hades into a real hell for the Greenskins. Deploying unwavering energy, Yarrick had initially focused on reinforcing his ranks by training civilians, both men and women, into true irregular soldiers to be supported by veterans of the Imperial Guard. Aware that direct confrontation was impossible, he opted for guerrilla tactics, intending to fiercely contest every square meter of the hive city. Fighting alongside his valiant troops, he made it a point to make the slightest advance of the assailants costly. The capture of each ruin thus caused colossal losses to the Greenskins. Moreover, when the enemy pressure became too great, the brave warrior did not hesitate to let Greenskins pass, to later strike at their rear. Taking advantage of the countless tunnels and levels in the city, they made the enemy's progress highly uncertain. The conquered lands changed hands so rapidly that advances reported by the bosses to their superiors disappeared as if by magic in the next briefing. The presence of the Commissar had been a determining factor in the city's survival. He was everywhere, intervening at the hottest points, setting an example by urging men to fight, not for the nobles of the head of Armageddon, but for the Emperor, for their families, and for this world that was theirs. Seeing what Yarrick was accomplishing on Hades, the remaining senior officers decided to entrust him with the command of what was left of the army. Just in charge, the valiant warrior ordered all operational troops to retreat to the hive cities to wage an attrition war. Although uncertain whether the calls for help had been heard, he made sure to persuade his troops that reinforcements were about to arrive, intending to preserve the morale of his men. The new strategy quickly bore fruit, and after months of fierce fighting, Ghazghkull became increasingly furious at not being able to finish with the hive cities of this world. The prophet then decided to go in person with the bulk of his forces to Hades, where, according to the reports, the heart of the resistance was beating. The assaults on the city intensified, but the defenders continued to hold. Several more months passed, when Yarrick finally received the news he had been waiting for. After almost 2 years of uninterrupted war, the warp storms had weakened, and the powerful fleets of the Adeptus Astartes were arriving in the system. Impatient to bring the Emperor's vengeance to these Xenos who dared to attack Armageddon, almost all the chapters of the mighty Blood Angels, Ultramarines, and Salamanders were gathering. Just arrived in the system, it was Lord Commander Dante, Chief Master of the Blood Angels, who took charge of the operations and ordered the deployment of his forces on the surface to relieve the defenders. The arrival of the Astartes did not, however, signal the end of the conflicts, and it took months of incessant fighting and millions of death on both sides to make Ghazghkull realize that he could not win. Every day, reinforcements arrived from all corners of the Empire, and the Prophet, as furious as he was lucid, gradually admitted the inevitable nature of his defeat. Aware that he had to withdraw before it was too late, he intended to make his departure memorable, hoping to convey a message to the humans who had dared to defy him. Gathering the bulk of his remaining forces, he decided to make those he held responsible for his defeat pay. He had to annihilate those without whom any resistance would have been possible. He had to crush the defenders of the hive city of Hades. This battle was unfortunately one too many for the protectors of the city. Unable to hold on any longer, the last defenses gave way, and the orcs spread into the heart of the hive where the families of refugees were gathered. Although the Imperial Guard tried until the last moment to protect the population, they unfortunately could do nothing, and the Greenskins ruthlessly slaughtered the surviving civilians almost in their entirety. Only the arrival of Lord Commander Dante's forces managed to drive away the orcs. This intervention, however, came too late, and it is said that only a few hundred humans, including Commissar Yarrick, survived in Hades, a negligible number compared to the billions of lives lost in that place. Fortunately, the months that followed allowed the forces of the Steel Legion, supported by the Adeptus Astartes warriors, to relieve the defenders of the other hive cities and thus avoid such carnage. Although victorious, the cost in lives and resources was immense for the Imperium. The majority of Armageddon's infrastructure was in ruins, and both military and civilian deaths were disproportionate. Nevertheless, Armageddon had endured. The tenacity of its inhabitants and the bravery shown by the Steel Legion in battle had aroused and would continue to arouse the admiration of all. Imperial propaganda did not miss this. It quickly seized on this formidable subject, taking care, of course, to deliberately omit the extent of the carnage and the serious mistakes of the ruling authorities. As for Yarrick, for what he had accomplished, he became a living legend for the population of Armageddon and for the regiments of the Legion. Even the warriors of the Adeptus Astartes could only be impressed by what this simple human had achieved, and to honor his courage, they bestowed upon him the title of the Hero of Hades. In the years following the victory over the Orcs, Yarrick led a fleet composed of numerous ships from the Adeptus Astartes and the Navis Imperialis to hunt down Ghazghkull and his remaining forces. Aware more than anyone of the threat posed by his enemy, the High Commissioner, with the permission of Lord Commander Dante, led a hunt across the Ultima segmentum for almost 10 years to find the culprit behind the atrocity that had befallen his world. But unfortunately, despite having come close to capturing the Prophet on numerous occasions during the years spent chasing him, the fleet led by Yarrick eventually lost him at the end of a battle in which he sacrificed his rearguard to escape. Afterwards, it was said that the warlord managed to return with the remnants of his army to the world of Golgotha, where he spent the following years consolidating his position within his empire by fighting against those who, following his defeat, had been foolish enough to dare take his place. However, it didn't take long for the greenskins who had wanted to succeed him to realize that Ghazghkull, despite his failure on Armageddon, was far from weakened by what had happened. On the contrary, the Prophet, because of the humiliation he had suffered, seemed constantly animated by a mad anger and rage. A rage that would drive him on and guide him in his quest for revenge. But first, he had to think about his next plans and how to keep the tribes united in the wake of his failure. And so, over the decades that followed, the name of Ghazghkull Thraka gradually fell into oblivion, to the point where the Inquisitors of the Ordo Xenos decided that they had probably overestimated the threat posed by the Prophet. Although he had led a powerful war, it had been broken like so many others before, and although the Inquisition did not know if the warlord was still alive, it did know that by the very nature of the Orcs, he must have been engaged in a terrible struggle to regain his status, a struggle from which he would probably not emerge alive. And so time passed, 50 years in which the inhabitants of Armageddon saw the Imperium use the prodigious resources at its disposal to rebuild their world. After such a disaster, many planets would have been abandoned to their fate by the high dignitaries of the Empire, who realized the time and resources needed to rebuild these now useless worlds. But Armageddon was not a world like the others. It was a world that had given much to the Imperium and would receive much in return. Cohorts of Adeptus Mechanicus techno-priests and their servants were sent to help rebuild the hive cities using the great machines at their disposal. To speed up the process, the Imperium even took an exceptional measure of reducing the number of men and women called up to join the Imperial Guard regiments over the coming decades. A most surprising move, given the ruthless reputation of the Departamento Monitorium, usually so reluctant to reduce the quota of recruits required by the Imperial tithe. Imperial citizens living on the sector's minor worlds were even repatriated to Armageddon to help rebuild and repopulate the hive cities. Obviously, these extraordinary measures were in no way motivated by comparison or any desire to help the inhabitants of Armageddon. No, the infrastructures needed for resource extraction and production had to be rebuilt as quickly as possible, and to do that, a large workforce had to be made available quickly. During this period of reconstruction, however, bad news arrived quickly. News that Orcs were launching raids on Armageddon's newly rebuilt facilities. Indeed, following the arrival of the Greenskins, the spores left behind had spread across the surface of the world, and recently, tribes of primitive Orcs had begun to develop in the equatorial jungles and in the heart of the radioactive deserts of Armageddon Primus and Secundus. So, the Legion of Steel was once again deployed in an attempt to purge the Xenos, but alas, decades of fighting were never able to eradicate them completely. Despite the few losses caused by the Greenskin raids, Armageddon was rising from the ashes at an impressive rate. In only 40 years, thanks to the colossal efforts made to get the world back on its feet, it had almost recovered its entire production force. With its construction almost complete, the representatives of Adeptus Terra decided that the world should be fortified even further, given its strategic value and the huge resources invested. Although Armageddon was already the headquarters of the all-powerful Steel Legion, the Imperial representatives decided to turn the entire system into a fortress, a place that no opponent would ever dare attack. Several measures were taken in response to this request. The first was to take the command of Armageddon away from the planetary lord and give it to the military council, made up of the senior officers of the Imperial Legion and Navy, as well as the highest dignitaries of the Adeptus Mechanicus and Ecclesiarchy. The second was to repopulate the worlds close to Armageddon and establish outposts of the Imperial Guard as the system's first line of defense. The third was the construction of 3 orbital defense stations placed on the edge of the system to monitor and counter any potential attack. Located to the north, west, and east, these stations were highly fortified fortresses several kilometers long where multiple guard regiments were stationed. In honor of the 3 greatest heroes of the Second War, they were named Mannheim, Dante, and Yarrick. And finally, the last and most important measure was to transfer the Imperial Navy forces from the entire sector to the Armageddon system. In order to meet this request, and to accommodate the thousands of Navis Nobility's vessels, major works began. Construction work lasted several years, and saw the Adeptus Mechanicus design a huge space base the size of a small moon, bearing the name of St. Joan. Every day, hundreds of ships from all over the Segmentum Solar passed through its docks, and it also housed a powerful defense fleet ready to intervene in any nearby theater of operations. Armageddon had become an unbeatable stronghold within the Imperium, a stronghold that no one would dare approach. While the work to fortify Armageddon's system was being completed, a few thousand light years away, on the western edge of Ultima Segmentum, a campaign was about to get underway. The Astartes chapter of the Black Templars was gathering all of its forces to launch 2 simultaneous crusades in the sector, against Tiberia to the east and Dimaris further north. The human worlds in these systems had long been waiting for a response to their call for help, and finally, after decades of struggling alone to push back the Xenos raids, it had finally arrived. The majority of the population had hoped for the arrival of Imperial Guard regiments, perhaps even those of the prestigious Legion of Steel stationed not far from here. But they had never expected the Emperor's Angels, let alone the terrifying Black Templars, to come to their aid. Terrifying because this chapter, one of the most famous of the hundreds making up the Adeptus Astartes, had a reputation that was as prestigious as it was worrying. They were seen as incredible warriors, among the bravest and most skilled in the Imperial armies. Their reputation for killing Xenos and heretics is such that many of the Imperium's enemies flee when they hear rumors of the Black Templars' imminent arrival. The sight of a Templar is a most impressive image. Wearing deep black armor, often covered in a white tabard bearing the heraldry of their chapter, they go to war holding their gigantic swords wrapped around their wrists by a chain, a symbol that makes enemies and allies alike realize that even broken, they will never let go of their weapons and will continue to fight until the end. Descended from the glorious Imperial fists, the chapter's members have a reputation for being uncompromising, cold and stoic warriors. Character traits common to the Sons of Dawn that often made them fighters with whom their brothers from other chapters find it hard to build relationships and fight alongside. But it was not their personality that made them feared warriors among their own allies. Although descendants of Rogel Dawn, the Templars long ago rejected the atheistic doctrines of their genetic father and adopted the beliefs of the founder of their chapter, a legendary warrior whose myths unanimously describe as the most powerful duelist in the history of the Adeptus Astartes. A being who lived millennia ago and whose exceptional talent earned him the title of Champion of the Emperor, the first High Seneschal of the Black Templars, Sigismund the Swordmaster. When he died, he bequeathed to his chapter his unwavering faith in the Emperor. It was a faith that only grew in his sons over the ages, to the point where their brothers from other chapters began to see them as true fanatics. As a matter of fact, there are many among the Adeptus Astartes who do not recognize the master of humanity as a god and follow his doctrines on imperial truth. For these people, the Black Templars may be great warriors, but all too often they are overzealous warriors who are hard to trust. Indeed, there are numerous rumors of abuses committed by the Templars against their own allies if they are deemed to have deviated too far from the Emperor's will. Whether or not these rumors are true, coupled with the secretive nature of the Black Templars, they often attract mistrust and suspicion. However, the Templars have no use for the fear that many of their brothers feel towards them. They have no use for those who do not share their beliefs. Living like monks, the chapter's warriors, when not at war, spend most of their time training to the point of exhaustion or praying and meditating for long hours. Although they tolerate their brothers from other chapters who do not share their faith to a certain extent, and above all out of necessity, they are no less distinguished by them, especially if they tolerate librarians in their forces. The Templars have no psychers in their ranks, and see beings that use the powers of the great ocean as repugnant creatures tainted by the warp. Their aversion is such that if a Templar has to campaign alongside brothers from other chapters who have psychers in their ranks, he will isolate himself for long hours or even days, meditating and praying to prepare himself to tolerate the presence of these abominations at his side. Only the presence of astropaths in their fleets is accepted, the Black Templars seeing them as true saints guided by the light of the Emperor through the Astronomicon. Their zeal, coupled with the fact that they respect virtually no rules dictated by the Codex Astartes of Guilhem or the imperial authorities, made them pariahs. Warriors feared by all, even their allies often hope they won't have to fight alongside them. But when the enemies of the Imperium dare to defile the areas of the Master of Mankind, when Xenos and heretics dare to blaspheme his name, they run the risk of seeing the fury of the Black Templars descend upon them in a senseless outpouring of violence that will only stop once every last one of their enemies has been crushed. This is the nature of the Templars. They are crusaders, holy warriors, destined to fight alone in the darkness. It doesn't matter to them that they are misunderstood. It doesn't matter to them that many of their allies hate them. For them, there is only one thing that matters, and that is their eternal duty to the God Emperor. So when the Black Templars, under the leadership of High Seneschal Helbrecht, heard that Xenos had dared to attack their master's subjects on the eastern edge of Ultima Segmentum, they acted as if this crime could no longer go unpunished. As usual, the sons of Sigismund let their hatred run riot, and the first few months of the conflict saw the two crusading forces advance at lightning speed through the systems held by their adversaries. After these initial victories, the Black Templars continue to advance further and further into the heart of their enemies' territories, gradually taking back each of their worlds after ruthlessly purging them of all Xenos taint. Too busy trying to slow down the Templars' advance, their opponents were forced to cease their raids on the human worlds of neighboring systems in order to concentrate on their own survival. The war went on for almost 2 years. But just as the Black Templars were about to break their enemies, the latter had to stop their advance abruptly. High Seneschal Helbrecht received a most astonishing communication that forced him to halt his crusading forces and assemble them for another theatre of operations, a place from which distress calls had been coming for weeks now. Distress calls inviting all available forces across the Empire to join them immediately. As inconceivable as it may seem, Armageddon was calling for help. It all began with simple turbulence in the warp. Turbulence reported by the probes patrolling ahead of the Dante monitoring station. tasked with detecting psychic disturbances that could indicate the imminent arrival of vessels from the Great Ocean, the readings they transmitted to the defense station revealed the imminent arrival of several vessels of unknown origin. Unperturbed, the officers in charge of the space fortress speculated that this must be a small enemy fleet that had become lost in the heart of the Immaterium. In short, nothing that could threaten the station's prodigious defenses. However, concern began to mount as dozens of new reports began to arrive, an unceasing influx of data with each detection of new forces approaching. Soon, too, the psychic readings emitted by the probes began to spiral out of control. Impossible as it may seem, the war seemed to be tearing itself apart, screaming out its pain in response to the colossal presence moving through it. Panic-stricken, many officers wondered whether these machines were malfunctioning. As for the more pragmatic ones, they remained tetanized, transfixed by fear as they realized what was happening to them. It was then, 57 years to the day after the first Orc invasion of Armageddon, that the veil separating the physical world from the immaterial broke in a wave of psychic emanations bursting with violent emotions. A wave of emotions intertwining all the hatred, anger, excitement, and madness of billions of creatures hungry for vengeance. From this Kraken reality, thousands of ships bearing the emblems of hundreds of different clans emerged at full speed. The tens of thousands of orcs who made up the crews of this vanguard seemed to be caught up in a trance, emitting thunderous roars that shook the metal plates that formed the frame of their ships. A mad cry of fury and unbridled joy. The greenskins were back, and never before had they experienced such excitement, such pleasure at the idea of fighting and washing away the affront they had suffered over 5 decades earlier. Less than an hour after their arrival in the system, communications with defense station Dante were lost. But before losing contact, the station managed to send a final report to Armageddon. A report indicated that in less than 2 hours' time, the Armada would arrive on their shores, and that the forces comprising it were just as numerous, if not more so, than those faced in the previous conflict. Though stunned by the return of the Orcs, the system's high command was now in the hands of seasoned, competent officers. These veterans, though unable to understand how the Greenskins had built up such an army in such a short space of time, were also aware that the system they had attacked was no longer the same as it had been 50 years earlier. It was now an impregnable stronghold, and the Greenskins would soon realize the mistakes they had made in wishing to return to where they had been defeated. Mobilizing the entire fleet stationed at the St. Joan's Dock, Admiral Parole of the Novus Nobilites set off at the head of an armada consisting of several hundred heavy cruisers to meet the Greenskins on the edge of the system. After several days' travel, the Orc fleet, not expecting such a rapid response from Imperial forces, was ambushed near the world of Pellucidar. One of the greatest space battles in the history of the Imperial Navy began. Admiral Parole's forces, led by the Apocalypse-class flagships Triumph and His Will, engaged the Orcs in a battle that lasted over a week. The Imperial Armada, although one of the largest and most powerful fleets in the galaxy, was nevertheless outnumbered by almost 6-1. However, the Imperial fleet was made up of the best ships in the sector, guided by skilled officers who were veterans of many wars. Thus, the first days of the battle saw wave after wave of Orc ships crushed by the demented firepower of the Imperial Armada. Every day, hundreds of thousands of Greenskins died, and every Imperial ship destroyed cost a dozen of their own. At this rate, Admiral Parole felt that, however heavy the losses, if the conflict continued, he could break the Orcs here and now. But all that changed when new reports arrived from the Yarrick and Mannheim defense stations. Reports that left even the most experienced and steadfast Imperial officers in shock. 2 more Orc armadas were arriving in the system. The stations were already lost, and their latest transmissions indicated that both fleets were similar in size to the one Admiral Parole was facing. When receiving this information, the High Military Council fell silent for several minutes, the silence necessary to realize what was happening. The Orcs had returned with a force 3 times bigger than the first one that had nearly broken Armageddon in the past. Quite simply, the greatest war in the history of the Imperium, one surpassing even that faced during the War of the Beast 10 millennia earlier. Although stunned, the Imperial leaders nevertheless had the presence of mind to order Admiral Parole to retreat to Armageddon in preparation for the coming conflict. The first reported images of the constant influx of the new Orc ships into the system left no room for doubt. From the emblems and banners they displayed, the man at the head of this horde was none other than Ghazghkull Thraka. The Prophet, more powerful than ever, had used his cunning and eloquence to turn his defeat into a unique opportunity to unite the clans in a crusade the likes of which the galaxy had never seen. A crusade in the name of Gork and Mork, with the aim of cleansing the affront that humans had inflicted on their race during the previous war. But what the Imperium didn't yet know was that Ghazghkull had never stopped thinking about the reasons for its failure. He had thought long and hard about how he would get his revenge, and the colossal army he had raised was only the first of the surprises he had prepared for his enemies. His horde could have ravaged any areas of the galaxy without being endangered. The Prophet had decided that Armageddon would be the place to be. Through the capture of trading frigates, he had long been aware of the fortifications built in the system. He was aware of Armageddon's new status as an impregnable stronghold, and this suited him. He was going to send a message to the whole galaxy, to all the Orcs and all the humans, to show them that he was going to break his enemies on their home ground in the place they thought was impregnable. On the worlds making up the system's first line of defense, Imperial Guard regiments fought bravely for many weeks, holding off the Orcs for as long as possible, knowing that they had no chance of survival. Every day gained was nevertheless a day given to the Imperium to prepare for one of the greatest challenges in its history. A challenge which the Imperial authorities realized, ordering the mobilization of all their available resources. There would be no holding back. No reserves. Everything would be decided in the Armageddon system. If the Imperial forces there were to be defeated, then nothing could contain the Orcs' advance into the Segmentum Solar. But despite facing the greatest Orc war ever seen, the Imperium had to overcome countless crises before this one. Its armies were experienced and made up of countless warriors, both proud and courageous, warriors who could not conceive of defeat until they had to fight. And so, for over a solar month, hundreds of ships from all over the Empire appeared in the system. Ships bearing the heraldry and banners of the Imperium's most illustrious regiments and forces. A gathering of insane, almost inconceivable size. In addition to almost the entire Legion of Steel, 15 regiments of Cadian shock troops were sent, as well as 3 regiments of Catachan warriors, 5 of Krieg's Death Corps, 14 of Aelirian troops, and dozens of other regiments of lesser-known units of the Astra Militarum. In all, a monstrous force, estimated at several tens of millions of men. The Imperial Guard was joined by many other forces, including those of the Adeptus Mechanicus, which deployed 4 of its Titanic Legio in their entirety, plus 3 half-Legio, 14 Skitari regiments, 4 Ordinati, and even an all-powerful Arc Mechanicus. The Ordo Hereticus sent battle sisters from 2 of its most prestigious convents, the Sisters of the Order of Our Lady of Martyrs and those of the Order of the Silver Shroud. The Ordo Xenos, on the other hand, sent several teams of Ordo Assassinorium assassins and 2 Deathwatch extermination teams. In addition to these reinforcements, the Imperial Navy ordered the regrouping of all remaining subfleets stationed in neighboring sectors to reinforce Admiral Perrault's forces. And finally, in the face of such a crisis situation, the Adeptus Astartes also responded by deploying more than 25 of its chapters, including the entire forces of the Celestial Lions, the Exorcists, the Relictors, and the Mortificators, as well as almost the entire forces of other chapters such as the Silver's Skulls, the Storm Giants, and the Flesh Tearers. Even chapters of legendary renown, descended from the first Astartes legions, began to arrive in the system. Chapters whose mere sight of their ships in illustrious banners gave hope to the warriors and civilians in the fleet and on Armageddon. A vision that reminded everyone that the warriors who had just arrived were from chapters that had never been defeated since their creation 10 millennia earlier. Among these, the giant warriors of the Salamanders sent almost their entire chapter, while the Space Wolves took 5 of their large companies with them. Although less numerous, the Blood Angels also returned to Armageddon with a force of 2 companies. And finally, among the latest arrivals, the ominous and enigmatic Black Templars joined the Imperial Armada with 3 crusading forces, almost their entire strength. At their head was the High Seneschal Helbrecht. Despite his chapter's reputation as a hero of the Empire, highly respected by all other chapter masters. Thanks to his unrivaled skills in space engagements, he was given command of the entire fleet by his peers, comprising all the ships of the Novus Nobilites, the Adeptus Mechanicus, and all those of the various Astartes chapters. After several weeks, the flow of reinforcements began to diminish day by day. The Orcs had almost finished taking over the other worlds in the system, and although they were still fighting for control of the St. Jowan's docks, their immense fleet was beginning its blockade of the system. Gathered on the surface of the world in the command quarters of the Hades Hive, the most important officers of the various Imperial forces were assembled alongside the chapter masters of the Adeptus Astartes to plan the defense of the system. Helbrecht had been given command of the fleet, but many Imperial officers were wondering who would be given command of Armageddon on the ground. Just then, an immense clamour was heard in the heart of the Beehive City. Tens of thousands of citizens were gathering along the avenues to see if the rumours were true. Having just disembarked from the last ship to break through the Orc blockade, the man who was to take command of Armageddon set off for the headquarters where the Imperial officers were gathered. He had deliberately chosen to cross the city in full view of everyone. The choreography was orchestrated to restore hope to people who were sinking deeper and deeper into fear as they gradually realized what was happening to them. The shouts of joy, the tears and the cheers of the civilians never ceased as he marched towards the command center. Within hours, all the Hive cities had received the message that Sebastian Yarrick had also returned to Armageddon. Even the glorious Astartes stood up straight, their helmets removed to honor the arrival of their new commander. Some of the younger battle brothers, unfamiliar with the man who had just arrived, wondered how a mere human could dare to claim command of the sector and, above all, the leadership of the Emperor's angels. With these murmurs, the veterans of the other chapters quickly silenced their younger brothers by explaining that this human was the hero of Hades, the one who had enabled Armageddon to hold out. At this name, many couldn't hide their astonishment as they realized that the tired old man they were looking at was the savior of Armageddon. Yet, despite the weakness of his body maintained by regenerative treatments, his fearless gaze was enough to convey that this human was still ready to fight. An intense gaze, burning with inflexible determination and immense courage. After requesting silence, Yarrick, accompanied by High Seneschal Helbrecht, began to explain the situation and present his plan. Pragmatic, he explained that rapid success would be simply impossible in the face of such a force. We'd have to prepare ourselves for a long and terrible battle of attrition lasting several years, if not decades. A strategy whose outcome seemed quite uncertain, but which was unfortunately the Imperium's only chance of victory. Tens of millions of men would die, along with thousands of Astartes, but the Imperium would have to hold out at all costs, resisting until it was able to form a stable front line which, through the continuous arrival of new reinforcements, would gradually turn the tide. Helbrecht took his turn to speak, and, ever the realist, explained that the fleet would soon be defeated, and that it was simply impossible to cope with the overwhelming force of the Orcs. The plan was to engage the Greenskin Armada over Armageddon, destroying as many ships as possible before retreating to the outskirts of the system. Initially securing the arrival of reinforcements via the Segmentum Solar to the south, the fleet would then take up the fight again, launching a series of raids to gradually weaken the Orcs. Meanwhile, on the ground, Yarrick would apply the same strategy that had already worked against the Greenskins 5 decades earlier. The hive cities would once again be transformed into fortresses to take the brunt of the enemy's onslaught, while numerous support posts would be built or reinforced in the deserts and jungles. Although the bulk of the battle would be fought in space, Armageddon would once again have to hold out at all costs for the long months leading up to the fire season. During this time of year, when the world's volcanoes erupt and the winds sweeping across the deserts become toxic, the Orcs, no longer able to fight to their full potential, would be forced to calm their assaults for a time. If the plan worked, and Helbrecht managed to weaken the Orc fleet sufficiently, then new reinforcements would be deployed to the hive cities to take up the fight once the fire season was over. Many Imperial officers looked glum in the face of this terrible realization. Defeating the Orcs quickly was simply impossible, and they knew that what Yarrick and Helbrecht were proposing was the only possible solution. A not to win, but not to lose strategy. They'd have to hold on at all costs, getting bogged down in a long, exhausting war until the enemy showed the first signs of weakness. The master of the Black Templars went on to explain in greater detail his plans for organizing the fleet, passing on to all the officers under his command the strategies and devices to be put in place. As for Yarrick and his staff, they organized the deployment of the new forces within the hive cities, and this time, unlike the previous war, the Legion of Steel would not be fighting alone. The forces of Astra Militarum, Mechanicus and Adeptus Astartes, not taking part in spacefight, were distributed among the world's various hive cities. Of these, the 6 main cities of Armageddon, Hades, Volcanus, Tempestora, Acheron, Infernus and Helsreach, were considered to be the key points of the defense system, and consequently received the most support. To lead them, the most experienced and competent officers of the Astra Militarum and Adeptus Astartes were sent to prepare their forces. When it came to the question of who was to hold Helsreach, the world's second most important city after Hades, it was Seneschal Helbrecht who insisted on sending one of his most trusted men there, Reclusiarch Merrick Grimaldus. Grimaldus was a veteran of more than 20 crusades in his lifetime. Although he lacked the fighting skills of the chapter's finest duelists, he was nonetheless an outstanding fighter, renowned by all his brothers for his great fortitude. After more than a century as a pupil of the previous Templar Reclusiarch, a great hero by the name of Mordred, Grimaldus had just lost his mentor and inherited this unique role within the chapter. A role that made the Reclusiarchs bearers of the Emperor's word. It is they who, in the most critical moments, restore courage and hope to their brothers and motivate them to redouble their efforts to crush their enemies. They are warrior priests whose will cannot be broken, seen as wise men and guides by their brothers, who confide in them their doubts and fears and call on them to confess their sins. A crucially important role for warriors who live their lives by their faith in the Emperor. However, when Merrick Grimaldus became the chapter's new Reclusiarch, many questioned Seneschal Helbrecht's decision, seeing in their brother a warrior too young and too cold-tempered to assume the responsibilities that go with such a title. The main man himself shared these doubts, seeing himself as unworthy to succeed his mentor. But despite his lack of confidence in his own abilities, all those who had fought alongside him shared the same opinion of their brother. While it was true that his cool, calm nature could be disconcerting from the position he occupied, when the fighting became more intense and the situation critical, he seemed transformed, as if animated by the Emperor's fury. In the hell of war, Grimaldus revealed his true nature, an extraordinary strength of character, an unshakable will, driven by his love for his brothers and his pure, visceral hatred for the Emperor's enemies. His mentor had perceived his pupil's true nature, and Helbrecht, placing his full trust in his old friend, accepted his request to make him his successor. And so, after pronouncing his vows in the heart of the Templar flagship, the Eternal Crusader, Grimaldus was sent at the head of 100 of his brothers to hold Helsreach. Grimaldus was distraught at the announcement, seeing the mission as a punishment, an injustice he didn't understand. For him, his duty was to fight with his brothers in orbit and die alongside them, not to defend pathetic humans and end his existence in a filthy hive city. Yet he was a Templar and would obey no matter what. Although aware that he would not be returning from Armageddon, the Reclusiarch could nevertheless count on the support of several of his squad brothers who decided, of their own accord, to come and die at his side. Among them was Bastillan, a great warrior and veteran of countless crusades, and a sergeant known for his humility, which had always led him to refuse the many promotions he had been offered. Cador, a brave and silent knight, his lifelong friend Nerovar, the chapter's apothecary, and Priamus, a younger brother with a fiery temperament but prodigious swordplay skills. Finally, to carry his banner and fight in his shadow, the Reclusiarch appointed his most loyal friend, Artarian, a tall warrior with a casual attitude and a scarred face, yet constantly sporting an amused smile. Having taken command of Helsreach, Grimaldus needed to know absolutely everything about the city in his charge. So, in the weeks following his arrival, he methodically studied the hundreds of reports listing the forces at his disposal while dissecting the logistical reports he received every day. Exhausting days spent without sleep, interspersed with breaks to meet with his team. Among the valiant officers under his command, the Reclusiarch was honored to be able to count on the presence of Colonel Sarin, a renowned veteran whom he trusted to lead the millions of soldiers of the Legion of Steel charged with defending the city. In addition to Sarin, Grimaldus could count on the support of many other competent officers, including Adjutant Quintus Syria Tyro, Major Riken at the head of the 101st Regiment, and Aeronautica Imperalis Commander Corton Barazath. After finally completing his analysis of the situation, the defense plan for Helsreach was drawn up and transmitted to the hundreds of officers in charge of the Hive City. 2 priorities were determined. 2 vital points that would have to be held at all costs, because if they were lost, this would inevitably lead to the fall of Helsreach. The first key point was the immense freeway running right through the city. Known as Hell's Highway, it linked all the city's other roads and provided rapid access to the various vital points of the Hive. Because of its size, it was the only way to enable armored regiments and titans to intervene rapidly across Helsreach, while also being a key point from which to transit all the resupply needed by the defenders. The second sector was the docks. Located at the eastern end of the city, far from the ramparts, Helsreach's docks were the largest on the planet, with dozens of ships passing through every day from the oil platforms to the south. These platforms, located too far out in the heart of the tempestuous ocean to be threatened by orc aviation, were to be the one and only means of supplying fuel to the beleaguered soldiers. In addition to these 2 priority objectives, other areas were deemed crucial to the smooth running of operations. Among these, the spaceport, because of its proximity to the outer walls, received immense support from the Legion of Steel, which sent several companies to secure it. The importance of this location was all the more important as it would be from here that Aeronautica Imperialis aircraft would take off to maintain air superiority over the orcs above Helsreach. In the centre, the Ecclesiarchy district received little support. This area was already under the protection of numerous Inquisition units and a sister order of battle stationed within the Temple of the Ascendant Emperor. To the east, several units were deployed to defend the factories needed to process fuel from the docks, as well as to protect the convoys supplying the first lines of defense. Finally, the bulk of the forces remained in the vicinity of the command center. This was a well-placed location, given its proximity to the outer and inner city walls, as well as to the Hells Highway, to enable rapid deployment of units to all theaters of operation. The general strategy, meanwhile, was fairly straightforward. Initially, the bulk of the Steel Legion units would be positioned on the outer walls of the Hive. There, they would aim to hold out as long as possible before withdrawing to the second line of defense and abandoning the ghettos and lower town once enough orcs had crossed the first perimeter. If the plan had been followed correctly, then losses at this stage would be relatively low and the Legion forces could then redeploy to the inner ramparts. With a smaller area to defend, it would be at this point that the Greenskins' advance would have to be halted to create a stable front line. However, Grimaldus and his squad had imagined the worst possible scenarios, and should the second line of defense also give way, then the final phase of the plan would be to make Helsreach a hellhole for the orcs by transforming the city into a guerrilla zone, where each unit would lock itself into strongholds to form islands of resistance. Whatever happened, they would have to hold out. Hold out at all costs for months on end. Hold out until the fire season arrived, and with it, the obligation for the Greenskins to calm their offensive on the ground. If this plan worked, and the fleet managed to make a breakthrough, then new reinforcements could arrive and the fight could resume. As far as civilians were concerned, only factory workers and dockers were allowed to continue working. As for the rest of the population, they were sent to live in the city's huge, squalid, underground shelters for an indefinite period. Finally, the Black Templars, although only possessing 100 warriors, were divided into several assault groups of 15 to 20 Astartes to intervene at the most critical points. The last reinforcements to arrive within the walls of Helsreach were the Titans of the Legio Invigilata. Although they would normally have gone to the Hemlock region to support the Salamanders, Grimaldus had managed, after a heated exchange, to convince the Princeps Majoris Zara Mancian to help him in his mission. The old woman, touched by the Reclusiarch's audacity and words, decided to leave to help him with a third of her Legio's strength. An impressive force made up of 15 Warlord-class Titans and dozens of inferior Reaver and Warhound-class Titans charged with escorting and protecting these armors of destruction among the most powerful in the entire Imperial arsenal. As these machines entered the Hive via Hell's Highway, the millions of civilians watching the scene could only stand in awe as they contemplated the slow, relentless march of these giants of steel. Yet, the sight of the warlords was nothing compared to the arrival of Storm Herald. Led by Princeps Majoris Zara, this Imperator-class Titan was a relic of the past, a class of Titan whose design knowledge had been lost to the Mechanicus. Measuring over 60 meters in height, the Colossus was twice the size of the Warlord Titans marching in front of it. Despite his shock absorbers, without which the buildings beside him would have collapsed as he passed, his every step shook the Helsreach infrastructure for miles around. With an arsenal capable of defeating an army single-handed, this god of war was manned by hundreds of Mechanicus adepts working to keep it running smoothly, and by whole companies of Skitari charged with preventing any intrusion into its midst. Grimaldus and his brothers, though accustomed to fighting alongside the Mechanicus, were nonetheless impressed by the arrival of the divine machine and his host. Yet, despite the great firepower he had amassed in the heart of Helsreach, the Reclusiarch had seen the reports, knew the orcs, and knew that all this would not be enough to cope with what was about to happen. Barely a few hours after the arrival of the Legio Invigilata, numerous glimmers of light began to be seen across the skies of the world. Distant lights that made the billions of inhabitants of Helsreach realize what was happening. After almost 3 months of waiting since their arrival in the system, the orcs had finally reached the orbit of Armageddon. In just a few minutes, the colossal firepower deployed by the two fleets destroyed hundreds of ships, exploding in a multitude of fragments that set the skies below them ablaze. A shower of fire and metal fell on Armageddon. The night sky was torn apart by a multitude of incandescent streaks. This apocalyptic vision was heightened when numerous pieces of debris smashed into the city's energy shields. The thunderous detonations and explosions of bluish flames against the shield walls sent the population into a panic. Indeed, like a sad return to reality, this deluge of fire reminded everyone that, after more than 3 long months of waiting, war had finally arrived on their world, and with it came the promise of a death to which they could not submit. Parallel to what was happening above Helsreach, a multitude of impacts formed gigantic craters in the ochre sand deserts surrounding the city, following the fall of numerous orc shipwrecks. The Black Templars, observing the scene from the ramparts, knew just how tough the greenskins were. For them, there was no doubt that these wrecks must be teeming with survivors and that they would soon be reorganizing and starting to build outposts in preparation for the arrival of the rest of their respective clans. It was at this point that Grimaldus received a communication from Colonel Saron, asking him to purge the bulk of the orc forces gathering around the city. Initially reluctant to fight an insignificant battle, the Reclusiarch nevertheless accepted the Steel Legion officer's request, understanding what he wished to accomplish. The battle would be of no consequence, but Helsreach needed a first victory, a show of strength to restore hope to its people. Arriving at the crash site, the Black Templars divided into several squads to purge the various wrecks of survivors. The Templars carried out this mission with disdain, knowing that these first ships were merely a vanguard made up of the weakest creatures of their clans, sent to test the firepower of the Imperial forces. What followed, however, was a massacre lasting several hours, in which the Templars crushed the orc forces with ease, without suffering a single casualty. Many of the warriors did not understand the order given to them by their Reclusiarch, who had no interest in giving hope to mere humans. For them, the mere fact of having to stain their swords and armor with the blood of these pathetic creatures was an insult to their honor as warriors. However, one of the ships that crashed not far from Helsreach caught Grimaldus's eye. It was the shell of a vessel stolen by the orcs and bearing the heraldry of the now extinct Astartes chapter of the Shadow Wolves. At this discovery, the Reclusiarch was overcome with sadness and disgust to see that a relic that had once belonged to brothers of the Astartes Adeptus had been soiled by the presence of Xenos. Entering with his squad, a cold anger rose within him as he observed what the greenskins had done to the place. His voice filled with bitterness, he ordered his men to hunt down the last survivors and make them suffer for what they had done. After more than an hour of merciless slaughter, the Reclusiarch stood before the last surviving orc, a massive creature, undoubtedly the leader of this band. Wounded in the crash, it was crawling on the ground in its own blood. To see a living creature, even an enemy, clinging desperately to life like that was a difficult sight for anyone to witness, but not for a warrior of the Adeptus Astartes, and even less so for a Black Templar. Advancing slowly towards the creature, Grimaldus came to stand beside it before turning it onto its back. Observing his prey with contempt, the Reclusiarch thought back to the rumours that orcs felt neither fear nor pain. Rumours they knew to be false, for although their resistance was high, greenskins too had their limits. And he was going to enjoy discovering that of the savage beast lying at his feet. Grimaldus placed his foot on the creature's wounded torso, bearing a cold smile behind his helmet. He slowly applied pressure, taking care to control his weight so as not to finish it off too quickly. Plunging his gaze into the orc's frightened eyes, he drove his boot in little by little, splintering its sides and slowly shattering its ribcage. He felt nothing but hatred and disgust for this beast, a disgust that made him want to vomit. The ordeal went on for many minutes, a torment for his enemy, but a pleasure for the Templar who savoured every howl of pain from the beast. When life finally left the creature's eyes, the Reclusiarch withdrew his foot from its belly and set off again. His pleasure had lasted long enough, and now it was time to return to Helsreach. The population had wanted heroes to celebrate, and now it was time to give them what they wanted. So far, the Imperial fleet had fought bravely, managing to hold back the orcs and preventing even a single one of their ships from landing on Armageddon. But the enemy armada could not be contained any longer, and every day thousands of ships from the 3 Xenos fleets converged on the Imperial forces, forcing them to retreat gradually. The huge firepower deployed by the 2 armadas had already caused millions of deaths on both sides, and the losses continued to increase every second. Seeing that his forces could not hold much longer, Helbrecht ordered the fleet to withdraw, though this had always been part of the plan. Abandoning Armageddon and his brother Templars to their fate tore at him. Yet he knew his men and forced himself to believe they would endure. When news of the retreat reached the defenders of Helsreach, alarms wailed throughout the city, their piercing cry signaling to the civilians that the hour had come to seek refuge in the underground shelters. Saren had ordered the evacuation as early as possible. Though several hours remained before the greenskins arrived, the colonel knew that under no circumstances could the population be allowed to witness what was coming. Only hours passed, yet the waiting felt eternal to the warriors of the Steel Legion. Proud and steadfast though they were, it was impossible not to feel fear at such a moment. A fear that, at the dawn of the 5th day, curdled into terror as they stared in disbelief at the madness unfolding before their eyes. An unimaginable host of vessels, daubed in the garish colours of rival clans, emerged from the orbit of Armageddon until they blackened the skies. Tens of thousands of ships plunged toward the surface at full speed, engines roaring. Some burst apart in the heavens themselves, detonating in blossoms of orange flame after overdriving their engines in a manic bid to be the first to reach the ground. A spectacle so deranged it sent the nearest greenskin crews into fits of laughter, yet for the humans, many of whom had never faced orcs before, it revealed in brutal clarity the madness and bloodlust of their foe. The most impatient pilots did not even attempt to slow their descent, slamming into the ground and leaving only the hardiest warriors alive amid the wreckage. The largest vessels, guided by more experienced crews, settled upon the still smouldering debris of their own allies. The hours dragged on, and the absurd, horrifying display did not cease. It seemed the greenskin horde was without limit. The realization sparked waves of panic among the Imperial Guard, who could scarcely comprehend how they were meant to stand against such lunacy. Upon the ramparts, the Templars stood apart from the humans. Disgusted by the fear rolling off them in palpable waves, they regarded their allies with cold disdain. And yet, for the men and women of the Guard, the sight of the Black Templars was a fragile source of comfort, an awe-inspiring presence rivaling even the terrible arrival of the orcs. Many Steel Legionnaires watched them in fascination. An immense focus radiated from the Templars. Those who had removed their helms surveyed the carnage without a trace of fear, only infinite contempt for the grotesque display of their enemies. Among them, only the bearer of Grimaldus's banner, the Templar Artarian, seemed almost amused, a broad smile curving across his face. Deciding he had seen enough, the Reclusiarch ordered his warriors to deploy along the battlements before departing for the command center. There, the first reports confirmed that the Orcs had begun erecting vast encampments and crude fortresses around Helsreach. Farther out in the wastelands, an immense spaceport was under construction, clearly intended to serve as a landing ground for reinforcements. For mad as it seemed, the seething tide of millions of Orcs surrounding the Hive City was merely an advance force composed of the least disciplined and most violent warriors of their tribes. Soon, the Prophet's true army would arrive, bringing with it the strongest veterans and the most terrifying war machines of the War. Beyond welcoming reinforcements, the landing fields would allow Orc aircraft to refuel and launch sustained aerial assaults over Helsreach. None of this surprised Grimaldus or the High Command, but the latest report from the scouts of the Aeronautica Imperialis was far more perplexing. The Greenskins were landing and establishing camps to the south, deep within the Deadlands, a barren region with nothing worth plundering and far too distant from Helsreach to serve as a forward base. The High Command had no time to ponder what the Greenskins were planning, however, for two far more alarming reports had just arrived from the hive cities of Hades and Acheron. The colossal army that Ghazghkull had been able to raise was only the first of the surprises he had revealed to the Imperium. As a matter of fact, for the last 50 years, the warlord had been preparing his plan for revenge, and it was with unfeigned satisfaction that he unveiled it for all to see. Ever since his return to the system a few months prior, the Armageddon's headquarters had always assumed that the Prophet would focus his ground assault on Hades in order to erase the humiliation of his defeat in the previous war. This was not to be. In the decades leading up to his invasion, the warlord had commissioned his most skilled mech boys to develop powerful tractor beams to equip the immense space hulks that made up his fleet. When these monstrous vessels arrived in Armageddon's orbit, they were dragging behind them huge asteroids ranging in size from several dozen meters to hundreds for the largest. From the first contacts his armies had with the primitive Orcs who were developed on Armageddon between the wars, Ghazghkull received confirmation that, as he had thought, the forces of the Imperium had gathered in numbers to prepare Hades for a new siege. Then, with a satisfied smile, he ordered his fleets to reduce this city to ashes. For hours, a flood of colossal rocks and debris rained down on Hades, until the energy shields protecting it were shattered. Unprotected, the asteroids razed the city to the ground, reducing it to a heap of ruins and pulverizing the Imperial forces left to defend it. The fall of Hades was a cataclysmic shock for the General Staff. The world's largest city, one of the crucial points of the defense system, had fallen, and with it, millions of soldiers of the Guard and countless civilians had perished when the invasion had barely begun. Yet, to this tragic news was added a second. As sly as ever, the Prophet, via the primitive Orcs left behind on Armageddon, had managed to make contact with the world's previous planetary lord. After the last war, Hermann von Strab and his retinue had been forced to flee into hiding to avoid being judged for the tragic mistakes they had made. Ghazghkull then offered the previous regent of Armageddon to spare him and to give him control of the hive city Acheron if he used his connections to allow his troops to penetrate the city. Seeing this as a chance to take revenge on the Imperium and reclaim his rank, von Strab accepted and through a series of manipulations among the city's nobles, managed to convince them that joining forces with the orcs was the only way to save their lives. Thus, following the fall of Hades, it was Acheron's turn to surrender. Pockets of resistance did emerge in the heart of the city, but they were quickly wiped out by von Strab's militia and the prophet's orcs placed under his command. To this news, a deathly hush fell over the planetary headquarters. 2 of the 5 fortress cities had just fallen, and nothing could be done to overturn the situation. The eastern line of defense had been broken, and Armageddon Secundus was now in a critical situation where only Helsreach and a few minor cities were preventing the orcs from taking total control of the continent. The mood among the defenders of Helsreach could not have been more gloomy since the massive orc landing, but concern and fear soon gave way to despair as news of the fall of Hades and Acheron began to spread. In the camps dotted around the city, soldiers looked grim and sad. No one dared speak, and only the sound of the first artillery fire from the ramparts could be heard. During this excruciating wait, the panicked cries of those who had lost their minds could be heard in the distance. It was hard to blame these wretches, and although their companions did their best to calm them down, the torments often ended with a commissar firing a gun to stop the panic spreading any further. Then, over the noise of the artillery fire, a thunderous cry began to rise from the plains. A cry to shake the walls of the city walls, a roar driven to the heavens where the orcs were expressing their desire for violence and carnage. This cry heralded the arrival of the greenskins on the outskirts of Helsreach, a cry that never stopped for the next few minutes, growing louder by the minute. The soldiers standing on the ramparts saw them finally arrive in a breathtaking sight. A green tide of tens of thousands of creatures covered the plains as far as the eye could see, and behind it, the skies of Armageddon continued to be torn apart by the relentless arrival of new ships. The Templars observing the scene stood silently aside, but they soon turned their heads when they saw Grimaldus striding along the ramparts. He didn't even glance at them, and went where he could be seen by the greatest number. Arterion and the other warriors in his squad then realized what was about to happen. The warriors of Helsreach were finally going to understand who Merrick Grimaldus was. The Reclusiarch advanced to the center of the stronghold, overlooking the bulk of the western ramparts. Before and below him stood thousands of men and women of the Steel Legion. Now that his arrival had attracted everyone's attention, Grimaldus spent a few seconds gazing at the frightened faces of the soldiers facing him, and then asked in a calm voice, "Do you see them?" Bewildered, no one dared reply, and many gave each other confused looks, wondering what he meant because of the absurdity of the question. Without receiving any answer, Grimaldus shouted his question again, prompting some of the nearest warriors to reply timidly in the affirmative. Staring for a few moments at the thousands of soldiers watching him through his skull helmet, the Reclusiarch turned to look at the horde of greenskins coming towards him. Grimaldus closed his eyes and let his hatred rise. Then, after a few seconds of heavy silence, he began to laugh out loud. Turning back to the surprised humans, the Reclusiarch asked them a new question in his amused voice, asking if they too felt as insulted as he did by seeing his army of rejects and monsters sent to defeat them. Lowering his eyes to the ground and shaking his head slightly, Grimaldus expressed his regret at having to ask such brave and valorous warriors to even waste ammunition on such pathetic creatures. The Reclusiarch stepped forward as close as possible to the ledge and, after observing the swarming mass of his enemies once more, turned his back to them, as if he was bored by their presence. He looked back at the growing number of humans watching him in silence. Then he asked again if they knew his name. A few voices among the thousands replied, but as orc artillery fire burst into the skies and the fortress's cannons responded, the Reclusiarch shouted his question again and this time the thousands shouted yes. His voice filled with anger at this hesitation. He reminded everyone who he was, that he was Grimaldus of the Black Templars, a battle brother of the invincible Legion of Steel, and that he had come here to fight by their side until the end. This reminder of their fame drew cheers from the troop company, but it was far from enough for Grimaldus. His amusement and anger left him to speak in a strong, calm voice, explaining to his brothers and sisters gathered before him that their actions would never have as much impact as they would now, that no duty would matter as much, no glory would match the prestige of the battle to come. More than a battle, a chance, a unique chance to go down in history, to be among those who fought at Helsreach and faced one of the greatest challenges in the history of the Imperium of Men. He finally stared at them and asked if they would fight by his side. Artarian and his battle brothers smiled as they realized the miracle that was taking place. At the Reclusiarch's question, the soldiers of the Legion shouted in unison that they would fight. Grimaldus repeated the question even louder, and the response was all the more powerful. Speaking again, he explained that this battle was beyond their duty, that they were fighting for themselves, for their world, and for their land. Finally, he asked them one last question. Would they let these Xenos slaughter their own people, their loved ones, their families, their friends, without doing anything? But this time, he gave them no time to reply, and promised that he would never allow that to happen, that he had come here to fight and die by their side, and that together they would throw the corpses of their enemies from the top of these walls until the last day had come. At the end of his sentence, a wave of noise crashed against his armor. Many wept, applauded, or shouted their desire to fight. Taking one last look at the men and women of Helsreach, Grimaldus raised his weapon to the fiery skies of Armageddon before inciting them to shout their hatred at their enemies. A rip of screams was heard, but it was still not enough, and the Reclusiarch urged them to scream louder, louder, so that the pathetic creatures coming towards them could hear their fury. The cries redoubled in intensity, an incredible racket that shook the ramparts and echoed throughout the city. Turning back to face the plain from which the greenskins were coming, Grimaldus stepped forward again and laughed. As the shouts and cheers of the Legion of Steel went on and on, he continued to laugh, opening his arms as if to welcome his enemies, and in an amused voice, he shouted to the pitiful Xenos below him to come and die at the hands of Grimaldus of the Black Templars. Laughing again, the soldiers shouted Grimaldus' name for many minutes, and finally, the battle for Helsreach began. The result of this first confrontation was a merciless slaughter in which the defenders unleashed a deluge of unceasing fire on the swarm below them. The creatures, among the most brutal and least disciplined of their clans, had been unable to contain their bloodlust following their arrival on Armageddon and had thrown themselves at the ramparts without even having prepared a plan. Without a siege machine, the greenskins had tried to get through the few gaps left by armored vehicle fire or to climb the walls using ladders or back thrusters, but these futile attempts were all easily repelled by the warriors of the Steel Legion. On the plains, the orcs who were constantly pouring in to join the assault were mowed down by the huge cannons on the walls. Even Storm Herald and the Titans at his side demonstrated their firepower by pounding the greenskins from their positions several hundred meters behind the first line of defense. This first battle began to give hope to the soldiers of the Imperial Guard as they witnessed their enemies being crushed in such a merciless fashion. Nevertheless, after several hours of carnage, the euphoria of victory was gradually replaced by astonishment and incomprehension at the madness unfolding before their eyes. Indeed, despite colossal losses, despite the fact that artillery strikes were constantly mowing down hundreds of them, despite the huge smoking craters left by the Titan's fire where a few minutes earlier had stood thousands of their companions, the orcs continued to attack, screaming, seemingly feeling no fear nor consideration for their lives. The Templars, on the other hand, had known from the start that this first confrontation would only be a mere test, that this was only the beginning, and at this very moment, the true, real armies of the Prophet were arriving and gathering in the heart of the fortresses still under construction. After hours of this butchery, the few thousand surviving orcs finally realized they'd never get through, and eventually decided to flee the battlefield and return to their camps. Behind them, mountains of corpses lay below the walls, while on the plains, deformed by the huge craters still smoking, a charnel house of decomposing bodies stretched as far as the eye could see. However, the celebrations of this first victory were short-lived for the defenders, for in the distance, transport ships kept arriving and pouring in more and more orc reinforcements. Several colossal armies were forming all around Helsreach, and among them emerged gigantic shapes just off the orc ships. War machines bearing the name of Gargants. Appearing as if these monstrosities should never have been able to move, these machines, similar in size to the most standard Imperial Titans, were composed of an amalgam of scrap and sheet metal and possessed formidable power. In addition to these instruments of death, new armored vehicles, accompanied by legions of orcs far better equipped than those who had arrived so far, kept pouring onto the surface of Armageddon. Among these gigantic hordes were monstrous creatures several dozen meters tall, which had been undoubtedly tamed by the greenskins. But as impressive as this landing was, the orcs were moving too fast and were making mistakes. As a matter of fact, the pilots of the Imperial reconnaissance aircraft noticed that the immense spaceport facilitating the arrival of reinforcements was not yet finished, and above all, was cruelly lacking in anti-aircraft defenses. Hearing this news, Commander Bazarath of the Aeronautica Imperialis saw a unique opportunity to hit the orcs where they least expected it. Indeed, if an attack was launched immediately, his squadrons could bomb and raze the orc spaceport to the ground, causing huge damage to parked aircraft and blocking the arrival of new reinforcements for several days. Nevertheless, this plan was fraught with risk, for although his aircraft would be flying over the battlefield, between them and the spaceport lay the orc hordes with artillery capable of acting as flak, and once the greenskin army had crossed, they would still have to deal with the fighters defending the installation. However, Bazarath felt that the risk was worth taking. If he acted quickly, he could destroy the Orcs' air force here and now, saving countless lives among Helsreach's defenders for the siege to come. The biggest challenge would be to get through the greenskin army on the ground without suffering too much damage, because considering the aircraft defending the spaceport, he knew that the pilots of his Thunderbolt fighters would make short work of them. But while it was necessary to act now to avoid the risk of the orcs reinforcing their defenses, Colonel Saren objected to this plan as suicidal. Facing this refusal, and knowing he had to do it, Barasath lied and claimed he had the Reclusiarch's authorization, forcing Saren to reconsider his decision. Leaving immediately to lead the Desert Vultures, the air unit of the Legion of Steel, he ordered all available aircraft to take off immediately and set off with his troops. These pilots, all experienced veterans, fully realized the importance of their mission and knew they would probably never return. Nevertheless, the Legion of Steel had a reputation to uphold, and they were determined to defend their world. Hundreds of Thunderbolt and Lightning fighters took off from the airstrips at Helsreach, knowing that this was likely to be their last flight. Flying through the skies of Armageddon, escorting the Marauder bombers alongside them, it took them no time at all to reach the city's outer walls, where their Steel Legion brothers on the ramparts cheered as they passed. Even Cador and Artarian of Grimaldus' squad couldn't help but smile at their sight, only able to admit that these humans were quite brave to set out to meet their deaths in such a way. Under the setting sun, the desert vultures came into view of the Orc army below them. It was a breathtaking sight, as it seemed to stretch on forever. However, they were not impressed. Undaunted, the pilots continued on their way. When the Greenskins realized what was happening, they unleashed a barrage of artillery fire towards the Imperial aircraft, destroying a considerable number of them before they could reach the vicinity of the spaceport. At every turn, the Legion of Steel pilots saw their friends' aircraft hit and tumble towards the Orc horde below. Nevertheless, these pilots were courageous to the end, trying to take as many of their enemies with them as possible by crashing into the largest groups of Greenskins. The slaughter continued until the main objective was finally in sight. As Barazath had always known, his fighters then demonstrated their full skill, pulverizing the Orc aircraft sent to stop them after a brief but intense confrontation. Unable to halt the Imperial advance, the few remaining bombers reached the spaceport and dropped their Hellstrike missiles below them. A deluge of fire spread through the facility, and when the bombs finally reached the fuel stores and the thousands of aircraft still on the landing grounds, the whole base went up in flames in a chain reaction that triggered a series of thunderous explosions. With their mission accomplished, the survivors tried to return to Helsreach, knowing well that it would be almost impossible to fly over the Orc army, separating them from the city a second time. A few hours later, only 15 aircraft had managed to return to Helsreach. 15 out of the several hundred still present the day before. Captain Bazarath himself had lost his life on the way back, but his sacrifice, like that of his men, had not been in vain. Even though the Steel Legion's air force was now virtually non-existent, the Vultures had destroyed all Orc aircraft on the outskirts of Helsreach, while blocking the arrival of the largest transport ships for several days. A heroic sacrifice which would allow thousands of their Steel Legion brothers and sisters to live a few weeks longer. At the head of the forces charged with taking Helsreach were the most brutal and ruthless clan chiefs to have pledged allegiance to the Prophet. Massive and cunning creatures, they were able to make the various warbands below them obey them through the cruelty and violence they were capable of showing. Although furious at the destruction of the spaceport, they were in no way worried about disappointing Gazkul. The loss of their air force was most certainly a heavy blow, but the landing fields required for the disembarking of new armored vehicles and gargons would be operational again within a week. Furthermore, although the landing of heavy vehicles had been momentarily stopped, hordes of veteran warriors were arriving at any moment through light transport vessels to reinforce the ranks of the armies amassed around Helsreach. Having suffered 2 defeats in the last few days, it was now time to make the humans understand that their recent victories had been insignificant, and that they were now about to experience a war the likes of which they had never seen. At dawn on the 7th day, the various armies surrounding Helsreach launched their assault, a coordinated and massive offensive aimed at breaking the first line of defense and breaching into the city. To begin with, the thousands of artillery pieces and armored vehicles gathered around Helsreach unleashed a relentless barrage of projectiles on the lower town and outer walls. Not concentrating these attacks on the ramparts was a deliberate decision to cause as much confusion as possible among the defenders. At any given moment, the immense buildings of the shanty towns would collapse in a deluge of rubble and dust clouds, causing unimaginable chaos within the city. The landslides caused by this destruction took countless lives among the soldiers bivouacked in the area. The shockwaves caused by the bombardment collapsed on many of the underground shelters where the poorest civilian families had taken refuge, burying these wretches alive. At any time, thousands of soldiers were dying, crushed by pieces of concrete raining down on them, torn apart by Orc bombs or swept away by the fires that raged throughout the city. Yet despite the hell unleashed on Helsreach, the soldiers of the Legion of Steel did not panic and held the line. The wait had been challenging, but the Reclusiarch's speech and the fact that they were now facing their enemies spurred them on to fight and honor their oath. As the Orcs' cannons continued to roll fire, the various greenskin armies began to advance across the plains leading to Helsreach. However, unlike the first assault, this time the gang leaders managed to control the warriors under their command, forcing them to slow down until the Gargants had done their work. The giant war machines then crossed the battlefield, closed in on the walls before unleashing a series of blasts that pulverized whole sections of the ramparts. Each blast took hundreds of warriors with it and sent a deluge of concrete rock crashing down on the defenders. It was then that the long-awaited moment for the greenskins finally arrived. Letting their fury do the talking, hordes of orcs equipped with bolters and monstrous axes poured through the gaps, spreading all over the hive city. A battle that would last several days began within the slums of Helsreach, before spreading onto the various districts of the lower town. This bloodbath saw the greenskins hurl themselves at the Imperial soldiers, howling their rage or laughing as they felt the joy of being able to fight again. An intense struggle, however, saw the warriors of the Legion of Steel live up to their reputation by fighting hard to stem the tide of the greenskins. For the Orcs, the first days of the conflict were a true massacre. Advancing through the city was an ordeal, as the humans they were fighting were entrenched behind barricades blocking the alleys or positioned in the countless buildings around them, using their advantageous position to rain down a deluge of fire on the attackers. Moreover, every time the Orcs broke through, the soldiers of the Steel Legion retreated in a disciplined fashion to avoid being overwhelmed, joining the areas still held by the Imperials before immediately resuming the fight. Where their troops were most challenged, the armored divisions intervened by sending hellhounds and sentinels to help the defenders, while the Leman Russ tanks chased down the Orc armor. Yet, despite this relentless defense, the greenskin tide never stopped advancing over the following days, until the defenders were soon threatened with being overwhelmed. Indeed, the arrival of new reinforcements directly from orbit was never-ending, and although these would have been more than enough to crush the Imperial forces, the clan leaders, after letting the most inexperienced warriors take the brunt of the losses, decided to accelerate their assault by deploying veterans to finish the job and finally take control of the lower city. These monstrosities, with massive bodies and heavy weapons, wreaked havoc on the ranks of the defenders while reorganizing the greenskins below them. But as the Orcs began to advance on all fronts, the situation took a turn for the worse when numerous reports surfaced that more and more Gargants were being spotted roaming the city streets. Tasked with dealing with these engines of death, the Titans of the Legio Invigilata went out repeatedly to relieve the defenders, returning to their base only to be replenished with ammunition. Hunting in packs, warlord Titans advanced through the ruins of the city, protected by several smaller, more mobile Reaver Titans. Accustomed to tackling the biggest threats of enemy armies, they inflicted heavy casualties on the Orc war machines. However, despite the undeniable talent of the Legio Princeps, it seemed that for every Gargant destroyed, 2 new ones arrived in replacement. Storm Herald, for his part, already had more than 20 of the war's most powerful Gargantia on his roster. Fighting for days now, through the flames and wisps of smoke rising from the ruined quarters, the machine's spirit of this god of war roared with the pleasure at the joy that this battle brought him. A joy he had not known for centuries, and one that strengthened his will to fight with every passing moment. Faced with such an unleashing of violent emotions, the mind of the Princeps Majoris Zara was almost overwhelmed. Exhausted by the days of fighting while containing the machine's spirit, the fatigue and the god's thoughts mixing with her own didn't make her realize the trap she had fallen into. Overconfident and unaware of the reports of the other Titans protecting her, Storm Herald fell into a cleverly prepared ambush, with several Gargants emerging from the rubble to attack the Colossus from all sides. Having lost his escort, the Orcs' war machines unleashed a deluge of fire on the Titan, who saw his powerful shields being destroyed by the violence of the assault. Although vulnerable, Storm Herald destroyed several of his attackers before falling to his knees on the ground of Helsreach. As he fell, dozens of buildings collapsed, creating a huge cloud of dust. Through the smoke surrounding the giant's body, swarms of greenskins came from all directions and began to climb the Colossus before infiltrating it. Knowing that the Skitarii regiments could not contain the Orc onslaught, the High Command realized with horror that they were about to lose one of their most important assets. At this news, Grimaldus tried to contact Zara to urge her to get up and fight again, but unfortunately, she no longer had the strength to do so. Losing Storm Herald was, however, out of the question for the Reclusiarch, and he ordered his squad to assemble immediately to go to her aid. After a few minutes' flight, the Thunderhawks of the Blank Templars dropped them on the roofs of the fortress built on the back of the Imperator Titan. Entering this sacred sanctuary of the Mechanicus, Grimaldus and his brothers began the purge of the premises, fighting for several hours and advancing room by room until they reached the reactor levels in the command room. Although the Skitarii regiments stationed on defense had held out as long as possible against the Greenskins, they had eventually been slaughtered in their entirety, along with a large part of the crew and the Mechanicus priests inhabiting the giant's body. Nevertheless, this time gained enabled the Templars to save the Titan's reactors at the last minute and reach the command room before the Orcs arrived. Just when Zara thought Storm Herald was lost, Grimaldus managed to push her to the limit, inviting her to fight and promising to watch over the old woman until the end. Listening to the Reclusiarch's words, and after a superhuman effort, the Princeps managed to regain the upper hand over the machine's spirit and pushed Storm Herald back up. Although the Imperator Titan had been saved, the situation was no less critical for Helsreach. The last few hours had cost the soldiers of the Legion of Steel dearly, and it was now clear that the line of defense could no longer be held. Listening to the reports, Sauron and Grimaldus decided that the time had come to move on to the second phase of the plan, and sounded the call. Due to the retreat of the Steel Legion regiments, the ghettos and neighborhoods of the lower town were left to their fate, and although these were supposed to be cleared of civilians, the High Command knew that reality was sadly quite different. Unable to reach the underground shelters situated behind the inner ramparts, tens of thousands of families were trapped within the sectors now controlled by the Orcs. Militias made up of members of the Helsreach gangs formed to wage guerrilla warfare in the Hive City's underground, but the vast majority of civilians were mercilessly exterminated. When the Greenskins found the makeshift improvised shelters where these unfortunates were hiding, they took sadistic pleasure in slaughtering one family after another. Scenes of unspeakable barbarity took place all over the city. In some places, the elderly and the youngest ones were executed in full view of the public so that the Orcs could watch the suffering of their loved ones. Elsewhere, the most ruthless Xenos used flamethrowers to purge the underground shelters where hundreds of frightened humans huddled together. An unbearable spectacle in which parents and children were incinerated, crying out in agonizing pain as the Orcs enjoyed the moment. These scenes were just a few examples of the carnage that took place in the streets of the Hive City, a company to which the Helsreach High Command witnessed helplessly. Many wanted to do something to help these wretches, but alas, the Orcs were far too numerous and their ranks were growing by the minute. Launching a counter-offensive was simply impossible, knowing that it would be a miracle to hold the inner ramparts. Pragmatically, Grimaldus and the Steel Legion's command could only analyze the situation and plan the next steps. The Imperial forces had suffered heavy losses, far higher than estimated. Hundreds of thousands of legionnaires had already fallen, the air force had been annihilated, and only the armoured regiments had managed to reach the walls without suffering too much damage. For the Mechanicus too, the toll was heavy, with many of the Legios Titans already destroyed or severely damaged. Storm Herald at this very moment was undergoing the most minimal repairs in order to be able to go to fight again. Even for the mighty Black Templars, the situation was not much better, having lost over a quarter of their headcount in less than 2 weeks. Despite having already lost over 50% of the Hive City, the key points of the system were still holding firm. The docks and factories were unharmed, and Hell's Highway was still under Imperial control. For the time being, the inner ramparts were holding firm, but the Reclusiarch and Colonel Saren knew that new breaches would soon open up, and that the Legion's warriors would have to fight with all their might to repel the Orcs and stop their advance. As expected, it didn't take long before the Greenskins' onslaught resumed. Using the same strategy as before, the Orcs ordered their artillery to pound the defenders' positions before letting the Gargants create breaches to allow their troops to advance. Nevertheless, contrary to the first assault, the reduced surface area of the upper city enabled the Imperial forces to defend themselves more effectively, causing the conflict to stalemate over the following days. Every moment, Imperial soldiers were dying under the relentless bombardment of the Greenskins, or trying to repel the unceasing assaults of their enemies, but despite heavy losses, the Legion of Steel continued to hold out. The battle went on for almost 2 weeks, with the human warriors of the Guard fighting valiantly despite their exhaustion. Resolute, they displayed steely determination. They had long understood the situation. Helsreach was about to fall, and if it did, the civilians they protected, their parents, relatives, friends, everyone they cared about, would suffer the same fate as those wrapped in the lower town. Realizing the terrible responsibility that weighed on their shoulders, they continued to fight bravely, a behavior that marked many Black Templar warriors, including Grimaldus himself. Usually so quick to feel nothing but contempt for humans, the Templar was always astonished to see what they were capable of when pushed to their limits. Nevertheless, the Reclusiarch knew they would all die here, himself included. However, the loss of such brave subjects of the Emperor would not go unpunished, and if he had to leave, he would fight to the bitter end and take as many greenskins with him as possible. With every soldier of the Steel Legion, the Templars also lived up to their reputation. Divided into several squads, the two largest of which were those of the Reclusiarch and Bayard, the Emperor's champion in person, the Black Templars kept stepping in wherever the fighting was most intense. Grimaldus and his squad were fighting fiercely in the north of the city to protect Hell's Highway, while the Black Templars' hero Bayard had left with his men to help the Ecclesiarchy hold the Temple District. The remaining Templars were divided into smaller groups to hold the southern side of the city and the factories to the northeast. With their armor damaged, their ammunition depleted, and only their swords to fall back on, Sigismund's sons, exhausted after weeks of sleepless fighting, showed no signs of weakness. Although few in number, their role was nonetheless crucial, as they deployed their Thunderhawks to help the warriors of the Legion of Steel wherever they were on the verge of surrendering. Fighting with cold fury, the sight of the Emperor's Angels of Death was breathtaking, one that would give hope to all the warriors they had come to help. Yet these weeks of battle only compounded their losses, and it was during one of these missions that Grimaldus' squad lost its first member. Ambushed, Sergeant Cador succumbed to the assaults of several orcs who tore his body apart with their axes. The loss of this warrior, respected by all for his calmness and humility, provoked the fury of Grimaldus' swordsman Priamus and the sadness of all the Templars, including his brother-in-arms Nerovar. Yet the Reclusiarch's warriors had no time for self-pity, and swore to avenge his death by unleashing their fury on the Greenskins. But despite countless interventions, despite weeks of incessant fighting, the inclusion was implacable. Nothing could stop the Orcs, and Hell's Highway was on the point of being lost. As the second line of defense gave way on all sides, and the Imperials were forced to retreat further and further into the heart of the city, the news came as a shock to the High Command. The Luciphius oil platform, located a few dozen kilometers south of Helsreach, informed headquarters that a huge fleet of approximately 300 Orc submarines was on its way. Within a few hours, the station would be lost, and it would take only a short time for the Orcs to make their way back to the Helsreach docks. The Armageddon's staff headquarters finally had their answer as to why Ghazghkull had decided to deploy only a part of his forces south into the heart of the Deadlands. The warlord knew that the capture of Helsreach was a crucial element of his plan, and although he didn't personally take charge of the assault, being too busy managing Armageddon's invasion, he had studied the Hive City's weak points and knew that if he cut off its fuel supply, he could deprive the defenders of priceless resources to hold the siege and create a second front to the east of the city where his enemies would not expect him. In any case, the news of the Orcs' arrival from the Ocean of Storms came as a shock to the officers at the head of Helsreach. Few had imagined that the Greenskins would be able to build such warships, and especially that they would not be able to assemble such a fleet so quickly. With the armies of the Prophet already advancing into Helsreach from all sides, it seemed that the end of fuel supplies and the opening of a new front to the east meant the end of the defenders. Hitherto, the officers of the Legion of Steel had clung on to the hope that they could still hold out, but this final blow brought despair to many. It took the determination of men of exceptional character, such as Colonel Saren and Major Riken, to push their men to keep fighting. Grimaldus, as astonished as ever at the will of the mere mortals under his command, also urged the most helpless not to lose hope. Yet the Reclusiarch himself was certain that he would die here, and that Helsreach was undoubtedly lost, but thinking about this was pointless. It was necessary to concentrate on what could still be done and to encourage the men to continue. Nevertheless, it was impossible to ask more of the valiant soldiers of the Legion of Steel, who were already fighting understaffed all over the city. So, in response to a desperate situation, an equally desperate measure was to be taken. Tens of thousands of workers and dockers, both men and women, were called upon to form corpse franks to fight. Knowing that mere civilians were no match for the Orcs, the General Staff decided to withdraw several hundred veterans from the Steel Legion companies and give them command of civilian groups. Each Imperial soldier took charge of units of several dozen men. Lacking the necessary equipment to supply them all, some were not even given las guns and had to equip themselves with iron bars, axes, and other bladed weapons. With no time to be trained, they received only the most basic instructions from the veterans guiding them. This makeshift army would probably not last more than a few days against the Greenskins, but unfortunately it was all that the headquarters could send to face them. Nevertheless, Grimaldus promised that his squad would do all they could to help the defenders of the docks. Already exhausted by weeks of fighting without resting, the Templars would have to double their efforts to stop the Orcs' advance to the east. The hours leading up to the arrival of the Greenskins were unbearable for the civilians gathered behind the makeshift improvised barricades, frozen in fear as they waited for the battle to begin. Some of the veterans tried to cheer them up, urging them to be brave and fight for the Emperor and their loved ones, but most of the Steel Legion soldiers paid them no heed, knowing well that within a few hours, the vast majority of them would be dead. When the time came, as usual, the Orcs arrived with a bang, shouting their joy at the bloodshed. As expected, the first moments of the battle were veritable carnage, with many civilians dying as they fled from the abominations coming towards them. Far from the image of stupid, weak creatures constructed by Imperial propaganda, being face to face with these massive monstrosities with muscular bodies oozing violence from every pore of their skin was an unbearable sight for most mortals. But worst of all was undoubtedly their gaze. Two tiny eyes from which emanated a burning anger, an uncontrollable, inhuman desire for violence. Everywhere they went, the same scenes of massacre were repeated again and again. Many watched helplessly at the fury of the orcs as their companions and friends were dismembered with ease by these creatures, who laughed loudly at each of their misdeeds. Some, spurred on by the veterans of the Legion of Steel, tried to resist, creating a few pockets of resistance within the docks, but alas, the vast majority could not find the strength to fight and end up slaughtered by the Xenos axes. After just a few hours, indescribable chaos had spread through the docks. Through the explosions and the sound of laser fire, the orcs enjoyed the moment, savoring the cries of panic and suffering of their enemies. The sight of these pathetic humans standing still before them, begging for mercy, their eyes filled with tears, reminded them how good it felt to crush the weak. But their pleasure was short-lived. Black-armored giants came toward them through the crowd of panicked civilians fleeing the battle. The sight of these cowards moving aside as they passed provoked nothing but contempt from the Templars, but nothing like the contempt they felt for the repulsive creatures standing in front of them. To see these Xenos rejoicing in the suffering and their victories over such weak creatures was an unacceptable offense. Mere humans might tremble in fear before them, but the Templars were determined to make these savage beasts realize that it was them who should fear the Black Templars, for they were the Emperor's angels, the symbol of his vengeance, warrior members of a brotherhood that had faced the galaxy's worst threats and remained undefeated for 10,000 years. With confident strides, their swords wrapped with chains around their wrists, the warriors of Grimaldus' squad could hold back their fury no longer and charge towards the greenskin horde. Many of the civilians fleeing the battle could not stop to observe the scene. From the countless stories told about them, all humans in the Imperium had been educated to believe in the existence of the Emperor's angels, an existence which, for the vast majority of them, would only remain a myth, a legend no doubt exaggerated for some, yet on this day, without realizing it, many were those whose bodies froze to observe this impossible spectacle, an answer to their prayers, the vengeance they had so long hoped for. Far from the noble and grandiose representation they had imagined, the Astartes fought with a violence surpassing even that of the orcs, slicing their enemies with their gigantic swords in swift, clean movements, while in some places, some of these warriors slaughtered the creatures facing them with their bare hands, tearing their trachea with their gauntlets, spreading their immense jaws until they were torn apart, or smashing their skulls with their helmets. An unbearable spectacle, brutal, ugly, and paradoxically, touchingly beautiful. Even if they were supermen, seeing these warriors face down hordes of these monstrosities made the soldiers realize the tragedy and grandeur of their existence. Existences spent fighting the darkness alone, facing the worst threats, risking their lives at every moment, and sacrificing themselves to protect humanity so that it may endure and their master's dream remain intact for even one more day. In this barbaric spectacle, Grimaldus and Arterion caught the eye of all humans. The former was a force of nature, smashing with his mace any Xenos foolish enough to stand in his way, while the latter stood in his shadow, fighting with his sword in one hand while the other waved the Reclusiarch's banner for all to see. Only the prowess of Priamus, Grimaldus' swordsman, rivaled that of his elders. Indeed, their younger brother would throw himself into the heart of the orc formations, screaming his rage before unleashing a deluge of blows from his gigantic two-handed sword, sweeping away dozens of greenskins at a time. Yet, despite this show of force, the Templars could not be everywhere. And even if each of their interventions cost the lives of hundreds of Xenos, the docks were immense, and the defensive lines kept breaking on all sides. Once again, it seemed that despite all efforts, nothing could stop the orcs' advance. However, unlike previous defeats, this one would mean the encirclement of the last positions held by the Imperials and their end. It was in this moment, filled with despair, that they arrived. With the docks on the verge of collapsing, Grimaldus and his brothers, entrenched in the heart of the facilities, watched as dozens of trails of fire cut across the sky towards them. The aircraft crashed through the clouds of smoke rising from the port district, causing several ruined buildings in the vicinity to collapse in on themselves. The sound of the impacts pounding the ground was one the Reclusiarch knew all too well. A sound which, coupled with the shockwaves, could only mean one thing: the arrival of drop pods of the Adeptus Astartes. Then, through clouds of dust surrounding the area of their arrival, the silhouettes of armored giants took shape. Emerging from the rubble with heavy footsteps, colossuses even larger than the Templars were unfurled. Their size, a legacy of their Primarch, as well as their obsidian-coloured faces and gazes that seemed constantly animated by flames, left no doubt as to their identity. Seeing these green-armoured giants advancing towards them, the groups of orcs who had managed to overwhelm the defenders of the docks abandoned their prey to pounce on these newcomers. A senseless act for these creatures, who didn't realize how foolish it was to attack salamander warriors in hand-to-hand combat. Leaving them no time to approach, the sons of Vulcan unleashed on the Xenos a torrent of Promethean fire from their gauntlets. Submerged by the flames, even beings as robust as the orcs could only scream out their pain in pig-like screams as they felt their skin melt and mingle with the molten metal of their armor. Through the flames and the smoke, the giants, seemingly untroubled by the suffocating heat rising from the fires, continued their slow, relentless march, crushing the charred corpses of their adversaries beneath their feet. Reaching after a few minutes the areas where the defenders were still fighting, the 70 salamanders gathered there hurried to the aid of the humans holding the pockets of resistance. When they arrived, the frightened civilians fighting on the docks were astonished to realize just how different their saviors were from the image attached to the warriors of the Adeptus Astartes. Unlike their brothers from other chapters, who often had nothing but contempt for mere mortals, the salamanders, despite their impressive appearance, showed nothing but benevolence and kindness towards the latter, protecting the weakest at the risk of their own lives, while trying to motivate and restore the courage of the defenders. Although intense fighting took place over the next few hours, the Greenskins were unable to cope with the overwhelming force of the Sons of Vulcan and were forced to retreat until they formed a new defensive line in the heart of the docks. With the situation now stabilized, Sergeant Vreth of the Salamanders went before to see the Reclusiarch to pay his respects, explaining that he was honored to be able to serve alongside Helbrecht's Templars. Grimaldus, although annoyed at having been rescued by warriors other than his brothers, nevertheless expressed his sincere gratitude to the salamander and asked him by what miracle he had managed to reach Helsreach. The sergeant explained that, at this very moment, the Imperial fleet was engaged in a series of counterattacks designed to weaken the Greenskin armada. Upon his return to Armageddon's orbit, Helbrecht had been keen to send support to his brothers fighting at Helsreach, but alas, having suffered heavy losses, he had no reinforcements to send. Asking the other chapter masters for help, it was finally Tushan, Lord of the Salamanders, who offered to send one of his companies to help the Black Templars. Although his forces fighting near the Hemlock River were also in urgent need of help, he offered to land his reinforcements in Helsreach to relieve the defenders before leaving the city to join their brothers to the north. Hoping for nothing more, Helbrecht expressed his infinite gratitude to the master of the Salamanders, realizing how difficult this decision must have been for him, imagining that he would have to let his own forces hold out without reinforcements for several days. With little time to act before retreating with the rest of the fleet, the Black Templar flagship Eternal Crusader attracted the attention of the Orcs, while the Salamander attack cruiser entered Armageddon orbit. Although under constant fire from anti-aircraft batteries, the ship managed to fly over Helsreach and drop its pods over the docks, where the Orcs seemed to be overwhelming the defenders. With this news, Grimaldus was pleased to hear that his lord was still alive and that the fleet was holding out. However, The Reclusiarch couldn't help expressing his concern at seeing the salamanders leave Helsreach now, when the situation was the most critical. After explaining to the sergeants that the city was about to fall, Grimaldus asked him to stay for a few days to help consolidate the defenders' positions. Unable to bring himself to abandon the Templars and humans of Helsreach to their fate, Vreth agreed, on condition that once this period had elapsed, he and his men would have to leave to join their brothers fighting in Hemlock. Realizing that his request would cost the lives of many salamanders awaiting the help of Vreth and his men, Grimaldus solemnly thanked him and invited him to meet at his headquarters. Although relieved to receive this most welcome help, the Reclusiarch knew well that 70 salamanders would not save Helsreach. Splitting up into several squads, the Sons of Vulcan, supported by the Black Templars, did everything in their power over the following days to help the defenders. Going out to protect the few sections of Hell's Highway still under the control of the Legion of Steel, the sight of the salamanders fighting alongside the Templars was most impressive, but one that soon turned tragic. It didn't take long for the Reclusiarch's warriors to realize just how different their salamander cousins were from them. The latter, voluntarily abandoning the objectives defined by the Templars, slowed down counterattacks in favor of protecting civilians and Steel Legion warriors. Such concern for humans only served to annoy the Black Templars, an annoyance that turned to anger when, during yet another engagement, Grimaldus urged the forces under his command to pursue a fleeing Orc warlord. A sensible objective, since the death of such a creature would spread confusion among all the greenskins in the area and save a lot of time. However, while he urged his warriors to attack, Vreth ordered his warriors to hold their position to defend a civilian shelter threatened by the enemy. Despite having saved several thousand humans, the Black Templar counteroffensive, unsupported by the Salamanders, cost the lives of several of their warriors and infuriated the Reclusiarch. This fury was made all the greater by the fact that, despite his admonitions, Vreth maintained a stoic calm while trying to resolve the situation, a behavior that Grimaldus saw as haughty and which irritated him to the utmost. Then, either out of grief at the loss of his brothers or out of pride, the Reclusiarch, following this fight, expressed to the Salamander that his presence was no longer required and that he could leave. Although saddened to reach this point, when the situation could not have been more critical, the Salamander Sergeant, knowing he could not reason with the Templar, reluctantly agreed and ordered his men to head north and leave Helsreach. In the weeks that followed the departure of the Salamanders, the Imperial forces suffered defeat after repeated defeat. On the eve of the 50th day, Hell's Highway was declared lost, and it only took a few more days for the docks and factories to be declared lost too. Everywhere, the last lines of defense were breaking down, forcing the few survivors of the Legion of Steel to retreat further and further into the heart of the Hive City. Whether it was the immense avenues running through Helsreach or the countless streets linking its residential districts, it was the same everywhere. Everywhere, the ground was littered with mounds of corpses where the dismembered bodies of orcs, civilians, and Steel Legion warriors were intermingled. These unfortunate souls represented only a tiny fraction of the victims of this dreadful war, the vast majority of whom lie buried beneath the rubble of the gigantic buildings that once lined the streets of Helsreach. As for the Steel Legion, despite having fought valiantly through the ruins of the Hive City for almost 2 months, more than 80% of its strength was lost, and even its powerful armored vehicles were now unusable due to fuel shortages since the loss of the docks. In some places, columns of immobilized and abandoned vehicles could be seen, while in others, certain tanks were now serving as fixed defense stations within the few remaining pockets of resistance. Despite this desperate situation, the humans of the Steel Legion, despite successive defeats, despite the lack of ammunition, despite exhaustion and hunger, continued to fight, but they had nothing left to hope for, nothing left to fight for. Their objectives had all been lost, and the vast majority of the civilians they were defending had undoubtedly already been decimated by the Greenskins, and that included their loved ones and families. No longer able to protect the besieged sectors, not a day went by without hearing the panicked screams of civilians whose shelters had finally been discovered by the orcs. Although the soldiers were used to it by now, hearing the screams and cries of these unfortunates remained an unbearable experience. With nothing that could be done for them, all they could do was wait for their ordeal to end. When only the laughter of the Greenskins could be heard, and the black smoke rising from the shelters could be seen, only then would they know that it was all over. Having become accustomed for weeks now to seeing their friends and companions slaughtered before their very eyes, their despair and sadness had given way to a deep hatred, a cold anger, driving every survivor of the Legion of Steel to fight and take as many greenskins as possible with them and thus avenge all those innocents. The only sign of hope in this hell was the sight of Storm Herald and his packmates advancing through the smoke of the fires and the clouds of dust, the last sign that Helsreach was still fighting. The Imperator Titan was only a mere vestige of its former self. Many of his weapons had run out of ammunition, his banners were burnt, and his body was littered with wounds from previous battles. Yet, despite the damage he had sustained, Storm Herald continued to scout the city for enemy Gargants. Princeps Zara, though exhausted, knew how important her presence was to the morale of the troops fighting for Helsreach, and so, to pay her debt to Grimaldus, she decided to fight until the end. Observing the scene from afar, the Reclusiarch seemed distraught by events. He had known all along that Helsreach would fall and that he would die here, but he could still not make sense of his death or the deaths of the warriors under his command. This war was being fought in space, where his brothers were still fighting and where a glorious end awaited them. Ashamed, Grimaldus confessed his failure to Nerovar, the apothecary of his squad, feeling unworthy of having been their Reclusiarch and of having led his men to a pitiful end in a city where their sacrifice would be forgotten by all. At these words, the apothecary could not hold himself back and struck his commander in the face with all his might, sending him to the ground. On the verge of tears, Nerovar angrily expressed his refusal to believe that Cador, his best friend, and so many other brave warriors had died for nothing. Then, when confirming to Grimaldus he had been a very poor Reclusiarch, he reminded him that it was up to him to guide his men in such situations and that he would do well to remember the last words of his mentor. It was then that Grimaldus, on his knees, bleeding from his mouth, thought back to the words his master had said to him before he died. "Our lives are judged by the evil we fight," a sentence he had never fully understood, but was beginning to grasp its meaning. Perhaps he had meant that even without a witness, even without a glorious end, even alone in the darkness, the only thing that mattered in the end was to leave having done everything in our power to do good. Perhaps that was the greatest sacrifice of them all, to die without anyone to acknowledge your efforts, to die without glory, having had the pride to stand tall, having fought evil to the end, alone, with no other purpose, even if it meant being forgotten by everyone. Coming back to his senses, the Reclusiarch thanked his friend and apologized for his words before promising him that the death of their brothers would indeed not be in vain. It was now time to die, not for glory or to achieve something that could turn the tide, but simply to send a message, to show all the humans of Helsreach that their struggle had not been in vain. With the last lines of defense finally submerged, Grimaldus and Sarin carried out the final stage of their plan. The forces still able to fight would fortify themselves in the few blocks still under Imperial control and lock themselves in to wage a guerrilla war. Knowing that communications would soon be impossible, the different headquarters officers bid each other farewell and wished each other good luck before leaving to help where they could. The Reclusiarch and the 10 or dozen Templars still under his command chose to leave to join the champion Bayard at the heart of the Ecclesiarchy. Accompanied by the survivors of several Steel Legion regiments under the command of Major Riken and Adjutant Tyro, the Black Templars set off to join the Temple of the Ascendant Emperor and their last brothers. This building was the oldest and most sacred building in the whole of Armageddon, built millennia ago by the first settlers to arrive on this world. Over time, this place had been transformed into a sublime and immense sanctuary, a place of vital importance for the people of Helsreach and their faith. Protected by gigantic walls surrounding the largest graveyard of this world, the Temple of the Ascending Emperor stood in the middle of this sacred place, where every day before the start of this terrible conflict, tens of thousands of pilgrims came to pay homage to their god or honor the loved ones they had lost. It was here that Grimaldus had decided to die, a pious place whose immense Gothic spans reminded him nostalgically of the prayer halls of the Eternal Crusader. Nevertheless, his end had not yet come, and he still had one last battle to prepare. Welcomed by the Canoness Sindel of the Order of the Silver Shroud, a strong-willed old woman in charge of protecting the site, the Reclusiarch paid his respects to the nun and offered her his help in organizing the temple's defenses. Over the next few days, the remains of the various units of the Legion of Steel that had flocked to the temple were reorganized, while the sisters took care of the civilians who had fled their shrines, inviting them to seek protection in the sanctuary's basements. It was during his visit to the temple, as he wandered through the subterranean tunnels overcrowded with refugees, that Grimaldus witnessed a sight that left a deep impression on him. Despite the fact that most of the civilians present seemed frightened and distraught by the situation. In places, like lights in the heart of the darkness, men and women continued to show their courage, bringing help to the wounded and lifting the spirits of the most defeated. Laughter could even be heard at times, particularly from the children crowding around him to catch a glimpse of one of the Emperor's heroes, the one their parents told them would save them. The Reclusiarch was at a loss to understand this species, which could be capable of such cowardice, but also of such courage in the darkest moments. He continued his reflection when, confused and sensing that the Reclusiarch had lost his way, the Canoness invited him to speak privately. Seeing a mere human feel no fear in his presence was the first thing that struck him, and the second was when this woman offered to bless him for the fight ahead. Not really knowing why, Grimaldus accepted, and after receiving the purifying water, he was taken to a small room in the depths of the temple where the sisters showed him the oldest relics of the world. There was nothing glorious about them, no finely ornamented weapons, no jewels or other sculptures, just simple parchments. Texts written by the first settlers to arrive on Armageddon to found this city. Simple accounts of their journeys, their doubts, and their prayers for the future. It was while contemplating these relics of another time that, for a moment, a fragment of his humanity re-emerged. There was something tragic and touching about these echoes of the past. So many men and women had sacrificed so much to build this world. An ugly, inhuman world, but their world nonetheless, their legacy to future generations. Billions of living beings had lived and died here, from glorious soldiers of the Steel Legion to insignificant workers. All of them had given their lives to the Imperium, and soon everything they had achieved, the only thing that remained of their existence, would be forgotten, erased by the Orcs. It took no words between them for him to understand the message the Canoness was trying to get across to him, for him to realize at last who he was fighting for. Unfortunately, this moment of contemplation and calm was short-lived, for soon the thick walls of the temple began to tremble. After a few days' respite, the bulk of the enemy forces to the west of Helsreach had finally reached the area around the temple and had set up their artillery to begin shelling the sanctuary. Although the bulk of the fire bombardment was aimed at destroying the outer walls surrounding the cemetery, an incessant deluge of fire kept hitting the roofs of the temple. Although the energy field generators protected the integrity of the structure, the spectacle was nonetheless impressive. It was an unbearable din, with pieces of stone and dust flying off the ancient walls with each impact. However, this was only the artillery fire of the Greenskins, as the few remaining Gargants in Helsreach had not yet arrived to take part in the attack. During these weeks of conflict, the Titans of the Legio Invigilata had destroyed hundreds of these abominations, and now only a few dozen remained. The pilots of these terrible machines had learned during this battle to fear the Legio, and in particular the promise of death that Storm Herald represented. Rising to his full height, standing firm, the god of war, despite the incessant explosions crackling his immense energy shields, continued to protect the temple district from any intrusion by the Orc war machines. Zara and her Minoris princeps were exhausted from the battle, having not rested for several days. But it was after destroying their 20th Gargant that day that the machine's Auspex detected abnormal activity a few kilometers to the northeast. Initially thinking that it was an anomaly caused by the damage sustained over the last few weeks, the crew analyzed the arrival of a craft machine of simply impossible size. Considering that she could no longer rely on the Auspex, the Majoris Princeps sent the last two Warhound Titans fighting alongside her to scout around. After several hours of hunting through the avenues of the city, Zara lost contact first with Fiona and then, a few minutes later, with the Ivory Fang. Unable to conceive that two all-powerful Titans of the Mechanicus had been defeated in such a short amount of time, Storm Herald hurried to the area of the foundry where their last transmission had taken place. Arriving near the remains of the Ivory Fang, the Imperator could only stand still to watch the shadow of a colossal form looming through the immense clouds of dust. Advancing, collapsing the surrounding buildings with every step, a monstrous Gargant, larger than the Imperator Titan, emerged from the smoke to face Storm Herald. Impossible was the only word that crossed the mind of Princess Zara to describe what stood before her. This abomination defied all logic. A monstrosity that should never have existed, let alone been able to move. And yet, Deicide was standing in front of her, a symbol of the Greenskins' madness. It had been built in the ruins of the hive city of Stygia, which had fallen a few weeks ago. A gargantuan structure of unreal proportions, designed for the sole purpose of facing down Helsreach's god of war. Behind the innumerable layers of metal plates and sheet steel forming its carapace had amassed several hundred pieces of artillery and weapons of all kinds, piloted by a crew of several thousand greenskins. An incredible firepower that vaporized the energy shields of the Warhound Titans in a matter of seconds before destroying them. Storm Herald had never faced such a challenge, but in spite of this, Zara's mind, fused with the mind of the machine, felt no fear and wanted only one thing: to prove that nothing would be able to stand up in front of her. There was no strategy, no clever maneuvers, no plan. Instead, Storm Herald and Deicide paused for a few moments before unleashing their full firepower. It took no more than a minute for the Imperator's shields to give way. After that, a deluge of explosions hit the Titan's body from all sides, killing hundreds of his crew with each blast. But despite the damage sustained, Storm Herald continued to stand his ground, returning blow for blow to his opponent. It was an unreal scene, with the two gods of war using their full arsenal to strike down the enemy first. The battle came down to a single error, when the Minoris Princeps, Carsomir, in charge of calculating the firing power of the Hellstrike cannon, failed to take into account a deficiency in Storm Herald's left arm caused by an injury sustained days earlier. A tiny error in calculation caused his shot to miss the Gargant's reactor by just a few meters. The mistake, however, proved fatal, and with no time left to recharge, Deicide took advantage of the moment to pulverize Storm Herald's last weapons with a volley of artillery. With its reactor on the verge of exploding and no means of defending itself, many of the crew members panicked and they saw their end approaching and tried to flee the Titan. But as defeat became a foregone conclusion and Deicide prepared to end it all, the agonizing Zara thought one last time of Grimaldus and his promise to defend Helsreach until the end. Then, with an inhuman cry of pain, the princess raised Storm Herald's arms and threw herself at the machine of her enemy. In order to drag him down with her, the giant thrust his hands deep into his enemy's ruined carapace, but just as he was about to reach the heart of his adversary, the final volley of fire sent Storm Herald reeling backwards and marked his end. There was something almost human about the Titan's fall. Staggering backwards, the giant collapsed, pulverizing the cathedral mounted on his back with a din that shook the ground throughout Helsreach. When the dust raised by his fall finally cleared, all the soldiers of the Legion of Steel could only watch in terror as the god of war was no more. As for the orcs, hundreds of them poured in from all sides to climb on Storm Herald's corpse, shouting their victory before pillaging and ransacking his body. The walls had been breached hours ago, and the cemetery had become a huge battlefield where the last remaining soldiers of the Legion of Steel fought side by side with the sisters of the Adeptus Sororitas. At every moment, hundreds of defenders fell to the orcs. Advancing relentlessly, the greenskins sprayed their spears of flamethrowers at the Legion's warriors facing them, while the most savage creatures threw themselves through the smoke, howling their thirst for blood. A thunderous roar that echoed across the battlefield, a cry to make these pitiful humans understand that their end had come. Unconcerned about their own troops, the artillery continued to rain down a deluge of fire on the temple and its surroundings. Unable to withstand the brutality of the assault, the last line of defenders had no choice but to retreat towards the sanctuary. Amidst the carnage, Grimaldus, accompanied by the last 5 remaining Templars, continued to fight fiercely, trying to do everything in his power to protect the retreating humans. The Emperor's champion, Bayard, was the first to fall. Holding in his hand the black sword, a relic of the chapter, he had fought bravely until the end, slaughtering the greenskins while constantly seeking out the most powerful specimens to challenge them to a duel in front of their bands. However, a tiny error of inattention after hours of combat allowed one of his enemies to stab him in the back with his weapon. Seriously wounded, dozens of monstrous creatures rushed at him, surrounding him before tearing his body apart with their spears. One of them pierced his neck, and the hand of the weapon was stuck in the ground, holding the hero's body on its knees, making the Templar lie like a puppet in front of his enemies. It was Priamus who, seeing the humiliation inflicted on his brother, rushed towards him with a furious cry, slicing and dismembering with his dull blade the orcs who had dared to defile his corpse. Unable to let the champion rest in such a despicable manner, the swordsman knelt down in the middle of the melee to remove the spear and allow the hero's body to touch the ground. Kneeling before his former master-at-arms, the orcs prevented the Templar from standing up, attacking him from all sides, driving their spears into his flanks. As he gritted his teeth, refusing to let pitiful Xenos hear his pain, it was Grimaldus who ordered the Spaniard swordsman to pick up the black sword of the Emperor's champion to succeed him. An order that meant he could no longer die and that his brothers needed him. Obeying his Reclusiac and seizing the relic from Bayard's feet, Priamus rose to his feet with a thunderous roar before letting his sadness and anger be unleashed on his enemies. While the swordsman slaughtered his opponents in a murderous frenzy, Bastelan, having lost his helmet, was fighting bareheaded alongside Arterian and the Reclusiac. Turning around after slaying a monstrous greenskin that had tried to attack him from behind, his face, covered in blood and distorted by wounds, exploded in a spray of blood from an orc's bolt of fire. However, the Xenos had no time to celebrate his victory, and just seconds later, his skull was pulverized by Grimaldus's mace. As for Nerevar, who continued to coldly kill his adversaries one after the other, he had tears streaming down his pale skin. He was going to miss his brothers. What pained him most was that neither their genetic heritage nor their bodies could ever be recovered. Continuing to fight through the chaos, the Templars relentlessly massacred the orc warriors who kept rushing on. But just when things couldn't get any worse, the Reclusiac received a transmission telling him that Deicide had been spotted in the vicinity of the temple and was closing in. Finally unable to hold out any longer, the surviving legion of steel warriors, accompanied by the Sisters of Battle and the few surviving Black Templars, continued to retreat towards the walls of the sanctuary while fighting. When Deicide arrived on the battlefield, he pulverized the last remaining Imperial armor in a matter of moments before aiming his weapons at the temple. But just as he was about to fire, he was interrupted by an insanely powerful plasma shot. A few hundred meters away, the last Titans of the Legio Invigilata, accompanied by the Ordanitus Oberon, had gathered to avenge Storm Herald's death. As a result of the wounds he had sustained in the battle against the Imperator, Deicide's heart was now exposed. Seeing this as a unique opportunity, and taking advantage of the last gift Zara and Storm Herald had given them, the Titans protected the Oberon war machine while he fired a final shot that struck the Gargant's reactor, causing a thunderous explosion and the death of Deicide. Fully aware that they could not retreat, the Titans knew they were doomed. But it did not matter anymore, and they decided to fight until the last moment, knowing that their mission was accomplished. The honor of the Legio Invigilata and Storm Herald was regained. Alas, the death of Deicide did nothing to change the situation of the defenders, and as the temple continued to suffer incessant artillery fire, the tide of greenskins pushed ever deeper into the sanctuary until it reached the nave. There, in the heart of the immense hall, thousands of the Legion's warriors, civilians, militiamen, and Sisters of Battle stood against each other in a final square. Carnage took place in the most sacred place of this world. An unimaginable carnage in which the air reeked of the fetid breath of Xenos, the entrails, and the ozone smell of laser fire. In this chaos, where dozens of warriors were succumbing to the blows of the greenskins at every moment, Grimaldus continued to fight relentlessly, using his Crozius to shatter the bodies of the creatures hurling themselves at him. His gaze paused for a moment, however, to take in the disgusting savagery of his enemies as they disemboweled a young sister of the Order of the Argent Shroud fighting to his right. It was Arterian who, with his 2 chainsaws, brought vengeance to the young girl, tearing apart the bodies of the creatures who had taken her life before taking his place back beside Grimaldus. For long minutes, the 2 brothers in arms fought in perfect harmony, wiping out dozens of their enemies. Their efforts seemed futile, however, as for every Xenos slain, 4 others rushed to take their place, all too happy to quench their thirst for blood. Breaking out of the frenzy of battle for a moment, The Reclusiarch turned to look at the canoness who was trying to motivate the last defenders. It was then that he finally realized that the end had come. In the slaughterhouse, many panicked and tried to flee without realizing that there was nowhere to hide. Nevertheless, the majority of these men and women fought valiantly to the bitter end to hold off the advancing orcs. Proud of their courage, Grimaldus grabbed the huge creature facing him by the throat with his gauntlet and dragged it with him. Climbing up onto the altar in the center of the nave for all to see, the Reclusiarch, despite the shots crashing into his armor, wrapped the chain from his wrist around the orc's neck and shouted to all the warriors present to keep fighting, before, with a thunderous cry of rage, he tightened his chains and shattered the creature's spine. Those who had fired on the Reclusiarch saw Priamus rushing at them before dismembering them in movements that had no elegance whatsoever, but from which emanated an unspeakable brutality. However, as Grimaldus watched, he could see that something was wrong with his younger brother, and realized that his leg had been pierced in 3 places. Shouting at the apothecary to come and help his brother, Grimaldus turned to look at him in the melee. When his eyes finally landed on him, he witnessed the most glorious end he had ever seen. A few meters away, Nerovar was impaled by the spears of several greenskins, who lifted his body into the air as if they wanted to offer him as a sacrifice to their deities. It was then that the apothecary, refusing to be a puppet of the creatures, grabbed hold of the stake weapon tearing through his torso with his only able-bodied hand and pulled the weapon towards him, allowing himself to be pierced and slide down the length of the weapon. When he was within range, he grabbed the sword at his hip and threw it in the face of the creature, lifting him up laughing, killing the monstrosity instantly. As his body crumpled to the ground, the remaining greenskins pounced on him, ripping him to shreds for what he had done. Grimaldus, with a look of pride in his eyes, looked away from the apothecary to see what was happening to Priamus. Just as Priamus was raising his weapon to finish off the greenskin facing him, a bolter shot slammed into his helmet, sending him reeling. Falling to his knees on the ground, the swordsman looked at his brother and whispered Grimaldus's name. But before he could reply, a spray of flame came and burned the Templar. Fighting his way through the melee with his Crozius to find his brother's killer, the Reclusiarch could only see Arterian's 2 swords emerge from a creature's back as he came face to face with it. Releasing his blades from the orc's corpse, Arterian came to stand back to back with Grimaldus before laughingly bidding farewell to his brother. Not knowing why, the Reclusiarch laughed in return. All around them, the stone blocks were beginning to collapse from the ceiling, taking away the greenskins and humans below them. With a final gesture, Grimaldus turned to see the humans still fighting at the back of the nave. Meeting the eyes of those watching him, he hoped he had succeeded in making them understand that there was nothing to be afraid of, that they had faced evil until the very end, and that nothing else mattered beyond that. Calling Arterian one last time to bid him farewell, the Reclusiarch realized that his brother was no longer responding to him. Turning to face the laughing orc who had decapitated his friend, the Reclusiarch was forced to his knees by the blows of his enemies attacking him from all sides. Then, like a bad joke, he finally looked above him and saw that his enemies were condemned to die with him. Still laughing through the rock slide, the church finally collapsed. Following the destruction of the sanctuary and the loss of the ecclesiarchy quarter, the last pockets of resistance scattered across Helsreach and continued to fight valiantly over the following weeks. Similar to their battle at the heart of the temple, unimaginable numbers of men and women perished fighting bravely for their world. Many of these heroes would be forgotten in time, but it was thanks to their sacrifice, thanks to their ceaseless struggle through the ruins and underground passages of Helsreach, that finally, after more than 2 months of war, the season of fire arrived on Armageddon. This period of calm saw both sides retreat to their positions and build up their forces with a view to resuming fighting in a few months' time. Helsreach had been over 95% destroyed. Its industry no longer existed, and billions of civilians and millions of Legion of Steel warriors had perished. Helsreach was now a dead city, but Helsreach had held. Before long, the butchery that had taken place here would be transformed into a victory by Imperial propaganda, a symbol of resistance and self-sacrifice to motivate the billions of warriors who would be sent to die on Armageddon in the years to come. Of the Black Templars deployed on this world, all perished and none ever returned. All except one. After several days buried under the rubble of the temples and countless corpses, he had regained consciousness and managed to extricate himself from the mass grave. Seriously injured, he couldn't understand why he was still alive when all his brothers were gone. From the beginning, he had always believed that he would die on Armageddon, yet now he was alone, the last of Helsreach's Templars. It was then, amidst the corpses, that Grimaldus went to check if what he had held close to his heart throughout this last battle was still intact. Relieved, he took out of his armor the few parchments he had been able to find among the relics in the temple. Helsreach may be no more, but its history and the memory of its people would live on.